before we turn to our first panel, we are here today for a workshop in the carrier of last resort rulemaking for the California Public Utilities Commission. I'm John Reynolds. I'm one of the commissioners at the California Public Utilities Commission, and I'm the assigned commissioner for the carrier of last resort rulemaking proceeding, for which we're all gathered here today to discuss the perspectives and proposals of carriers and advocates on how to update the COLA rules, if at all. I appreciate the proposals the parties are already developing and what I think is a broadly shared consensus that all Californians should be connected, that we need modern networks to support our connectivity needs, and that we should not leave anyone behind, including customers with disabilities, low-income customers, and those in remote or low-density communities. All of that said, I do want to express a frustration I've encountered in our COLA discussions thus far, intermingling carrier of last resort with copper retirement. These are separate topics, and as you have all surely heard from me many times, our carrier of last resort rules are designed to be technology neutral. We don't care if you serve customers with copper, fiber, or mobile, we just care that you serve them. I don't like to hide the ball, so here are a few topics on my mind that I hope to hear more about today from all of the parties who are participating. First, I'm concerned that coverage maps overstate the coverage and capacity that customers experience in the real world, particularly in low-density communities. For proposals relying on such maps for carrier of last resort relief, how should we weigh risks that real-world coverage is inadequate, and how might we leverage other technical data to support our evaluation? Second, I recognize the asymmetric regulation of carriers of last resort versus other types of carriers. And I want to hear more specifically from Cal advocates about whether their carrier of last resort relief proposal continues that asymmetry and how to justify such treatment. Third, is there anything about our rules today that is not technology neutral? And if so, what can we do to address that? Fourth, if we already have adequate infrastructure and coverage, why aren't our carriers of last resort delivering service over that infrastructure today? Fifth, if we look to competition for parts of the state that have multiple competing communications providers to ensure service instead of a carrier of last resort, how do we manage the risks of consolidation in the industry, reducing that competitive pressure? If we were to move to a highly concentrated market in a part of the state where we removed carrier of last resort requirements, for example, would it even be feasible to reinstate a carrier of last resort to address the reduced competition? Would there be other regulatory regimes that would protect against that eventuality? Sixth, should changes to carrier of last resort rules address resiliency and disaster response needs in our state? How could such changes be neutral to different technologies, though different technologies have completely different network architecture? Seventh, I'm also interested in how we can get better customer-centered data on the needs of deaf and disabled customers to inform our rule reforms. I recognize that many smartphones offer accessibility features that customers likely rely on, and I want to better understand any customers whose needs are best served by a carrier of last resort today. I look forward to hearing from all of you about these topics and more, and it is a pleasure to be here with you in Los Angeles, in our Los Angeles office, and I want to give a welcome and thank you to all of the panelists who are here with us today and who will be taking us into a deeper dive into important topics related to the carrier of last resort obligations. I also want to offer my thanks to the CPUC-IT staff who is helping to make sure that everything runs smoothly during today's event. Last but not least, I would like to acknowledge the Communications Division staff who organized today's workshop and without whom today's panels would not be possible. I'm pleased to have Communications Director Rob Osborne here today with us, who will be co-moderating the workshop panels with me, as well as Judge Klagola. I also want to acknowledge my Bagley-Keene partner, Commissioner Darcy Houck, who could not be here today but is closely following and is keenly interested in the discussions that will be happening at today's workshop. So with all of that said, we can now turn to our first panel. So I will ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves in turn. Why don't we start with Mr. Ware?
1, 2, that's better. Hey, good morning. My name is Lance Ware. I am representing Equal today, a participant in this matter. I'm also a director of Digital Equity Foundation, which is focused on rural broadband and solutions there. that is the majority owner of AVX Networks, who is a CLEC in the state of California. From that perspective, I've got some fairly in-depth experience on the ground in various rural locations, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in this. AVX was started essentially to address the broadband needs of Catalina, Iowa, and California, which some may or may not know is part of California and has 4,000 full-time residents and 1 million tourists a year. So those folks are close to my heart and deeply affected by not only this decision, but broadband and the grants and funding for those things thereof. I kind of echo Commissioner Reynolds' thoughts on voice service, pod service, whatever form it takes, technology agnostic has to be agnostic, and certainly affects folks in rural locations seemingly more so than those in urban. And to that end, looking at data for Cal OES and 911, we see outages, in the 30s for 2023, 30 counts, hours plus 48 hours of downtime. So these basic services are hard to deliver. I'm not saying they're not easy, but to take away landline POTS as it stands and rely solely on mobile is very short-sighted in my view. And so, again, to Commissioner Reynolds' credit on the coverage, these broadband maps are very overstated at best. And I have a huge problem with the fact that the existing carriers of last resort are looking at leveraging those to ensure ubiquitous coverage for everyone. The FCC itself has wireless test apps. They ask you to certify that you're outdoors when you make a report. That doesn't reflect a consumer at night in their house trying to call 911 for the police or a fire, maybe potentially in the back room of their house against a hill, around a corner in rough terrain. So we have to do better, much better than the existing maps if we're intending on taking away basic POT service. I think there's a model for this that we've shared in our reports, which is I've been called to replace a lot of POTS lines on Catalina for alarm panels, in no small part because the price is being driven up, I believe, unfairly, and driving businesses off of those. And so we've been looking at managed facilities voice networks that actively manage the connection and make sure it's up for those folks. And so there is a way to get away from copper. I'm not saying there's not, but until that time, as we know who needs coverage and where, and we reinforce the broadband maps, it's very hard to do. And with respect to copper, I'd like to say that the last withdrawal proceeding, we're aware of at least 2 folks that tried to engage with AT&T on potentially taking over some of that plant and assets, one on Catalina, one not. And the response was negligible. So even for folks that thought that that was a viable solution, even if in the short term, there needs to be an ability for folks to know what those assets are, what state they're in, if they're in the best state of repair or operable for any transition to happen for those willing. And again, I think broadband's great, VoIP is great. You got to make sure that there's redundant paths through the middle mile and that all those facilities have battery backup and everything else to ensure at least the same coverage that folks are and availability that folks are currently getting for their services. And I think that's, we got to get to the root of that in this proceeding before we potentially take away access to basic POT service. Thank you.
Hi, Tracy. Mine doesn't want to work. Tracy Ryan with RCRC. And I'll go further into RCRC. I'll turn it over to AT&T.
My name's David Disher. I worked for AT&T since... My name's David Disher. I've worked for AT&T since 1985. I did not work on 9610-066. I was working on the companion dockets on local competition. And I have a presentation that responds to the questions for this panel. I appreciate your questions, Commissioner. Some I will address, some I won't. I'd love to have an opportunity after all the presentations to address any questions that you have specifically. Thank you. Patrick.
Yes, good morning. Patrick Rossfall from BRB Law. Been doing this work for about 24 years for various kinds of telecommunications companies, including Consolidated Communications, who I'm here representing today. And for those who don't know the history, Consolidated started as a small LEC serving an area in Placer County and kind of northeast Sacramento County that at one time was quite agricultural. It was called Roseville Telephone at the time because it was centered in the town of Roseville, and then of course grew along with the Sacramento metropolitan area into Sure West Communications, and then ultimately to Consolidated Communications. And through my background in the practice group that we've had, and the other law firm I worked at before, we've represented that company going back to the 1980s, even before the breakup of AT&T. So have a long familiarity with what they've experienced and look forward to sharing some of that and also answering your questions, Commissioner.
Good morning. I'm Regina Costa. I'm with Turn, and I shudder to think about the math on this, but I've been with Turn since 1991, beginning with the implementation rate design case where they implemented the new regulatory framework, working through TA 96, and basically most proceedings ever since then. So I'm familiar with the issues and how things have changed. And I very much appreciate the questions posed by Commissioner Reynolds. I think I do address some of these, at least some of them, in the responses to the questions that were set out by staff. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. And we posed as an agency kind of a broad set of questions for you all to present upon, and I'll read those now and then turn back to you all for your presentations. And I know Mr. Ware, you've spoken a bit already. I'm not sure if there's more that you want to say on these, or if we can move directly down the line, but we can work that out. So first we asked, how can the Commission uphold the imperative of universal service, including the Commission's formal prohibition on redlining, while allowing or providing a path for carrier of last resort obligations to be relinquished? Describe how the Commission should determine whether a carrier should be able to relinquish its carrier of last resort obligations. So we posed these broad questions to you, and I will now turn to our panelists to offer their opening presentations.
Thank you, Commissioner. After 30 years, it is certainly time to re-examine the need for carrier of last resort. A lot has changed. For about a century, the Commission assured Californians universal service through a local telephone monopoly. There was a compact between the telephone company and California. In return for an obligation to serve all customers, a monopoly and guaranteed earnings were given. 30 years ago, the Commission opened the California market to competition. To assure Californians continued to receive a minimum level of telephone service, the Commission established carrier of last resort, or the COLR obligation, as a transition measure as competition was opened and took hold. At that time, AT&T served about 95% of the households in its territory, as shown on this slide. But it was to be a transition policy. To assure Californians affordable service, the Commission relied on CHCFB to subsidize high-cost lines and the Lifeline program. About that time, the Commission also, in a separate rulemaking on local competition and carrier competitive local exchange carriers, announced its opposition to redlining. That prohibition on redlining was focused on CLECs in that proceeding, not COLRs, but it is rooted in the Public Utilities Code, anti-discrimination provisions applicable to all telephone companies. Here's where we are today. Fewer than 5 out of every household in AT&T's territory has basic service. Walk in your neighborhood and you go past 20 houses. 1 house will have AT&T's basic service. That means all Californians virtually have their voice needs met by either mobile or VoIP. The monopoly compact between AT&T and California was broken a long time ago, as was discussed last Friday from the speakers from other commissions. You've asked, how can the commission ensure the imperative of universal service without COLR? Californians have already answered that question. They have all but abandoned basic service for other alternatives available in AT&T's territory. And their abandonment of AT&T's basic service shows these alternatives are affordable. This is even true in high-cost areas where subsidized lines have gone from about $4 million in 1996 to about $40,000 today. The harm of COLR is visually helped by this slide as well. Though only 5 households have basic service in AT&T's territory, AT&T's network must be maintained to be ready to serve all 100. As COLR is reformed, AT&T is committed to leaving nobody behind. A thoughtful, phased approach is needed that recognizes 3 different areas. The first area, 1, is areas with no demand. That means no population, no basic service customers, no serviceable locations. The next group are areas that are well served with an alternative network. The third group are areas not yet well served. AT&T's proposal for reform continues to protect Californians' universal service. The policy debate we need to be having should focus on areas without alternatives. We acknowledge they exist, and COLR can remain there until the areas become well served, at which time the commission should allow COLR relinquishment and tariff withdrawal. But in areas that are already well served or areas that have no demand, the commission should immediately allow COLR relinquishment and tariff withdrawal. The details of AT&T California's proposal for reform begins with what is the service for universal service. It is already merely a voice grade line with access to 911 because that's the only thing that the vast majority of Californians want. They've abandoned the basic service definition service that the commission requires COLRs to provide, and trying to create a new basic service definition is unnecessary, harmful, not technology neutral, and should be abandoned. Next, areas with one alternative network and areas with no demand should have COLR relinquishment, and basic service withdrawal should be allowed. Again, areas not yet well served, AT&T would remain the COLR until that area is well served, at which time the commission should establish a streamlined relinquishment and tariff withdrawal process. We've proposed that the analysis of well served or not be done at the census block level. It allows granular analysis of where there is coverage and where there is not coverage. To determine if a census block is well served, the commission should use the FCC's National Broadband Map. Substantial resources have been invested in developing these maps. They've undergone extensive location level analysis and validation. And the virtual abandonment of basic service in these areas for alternatives identified in these maps justify and validate their use. These maps also allow the number of alternative networks for relinquishment to be altered. Before I get to the maps depicting AT&T's proposal, I want to address the question about what happens if an area becomes no longer well served. In our view, that's not likely to happen. The hard part of building a network is the investment and time. So if a provider runs into financial difficulty and exits the market, that network will remain and will be taken up by another provider. This happened over and over again 20, 25 years ago when there was a glut of fiber capacity in downtown areas and CLECs went out of business and subsequent providers came and purchased those assets. But in any event, the possibility of an area not becoming well-served after it is well-served, the answer is not a blanket COLR requirement. The answer would be a targeted approach, limited in time and area, rather than a blanket approach. Now, the maps I'm going to show are a rural county, an urban county, and a statewide map. These are using the National Broadband map with one alternative. The first map is of Fresno County. This is a rather rural county with one urban area in Fresno. The beige on this map is outside of AT&T's territory. The orange, and the legend is there, the orange is areas that are, we say, well-served, that have one or more alternative providers. This is, again, at the census block level. The blue are areas where there aren't any customers or any serviceable locations. And then the gray are areas that there is demand, but the maps show that there aren't any alternatives. So AT&T's proposal is that the orange and the blue areas, the well-served and no-demand areas, COLR relinquishment and tariff withdrawal would be permitted. And in the gray areas, COLR would remain, AT&T would remain the COLR until they become well-served. Now, we heard last Friday from the sheriffs, the tribal representatives, the supervisors about houses that don't have an alternative. Our maps and proposal identify those gray areas, and we would remain the COLR there. But two of the supervisors from Inyo and Lake, they themselves said they abandoned, dropped their AT&T landline over 10 years ago. In those well-served areas of their rural communities, AT&T should be permitted to relinquish its COLR and withdraw the basic service tariff. The next map is Orange County. This is close by. It's a rather urban, suburban area. And again, the orange represents one alternative or more. The beige is outside of AT&T's territory. The blue represents there isn't any demand in those census blocks. And again, the gray are areas where there is demand, but there isn't an alternative. And again, our proposal is that the orange and the blue, the well-served and the no demand, we would be allowed to relinquish our COLR obligation and withdraw our basic service tariff. But in the gray, our COLR obligation and basic service would remain available. The next map is a statewide map. As I said, you have the statewide map, and you can drill down to cities and counties and census block groups, clusters, or census blocks themselves. And this is depicting with the same orange being well-served with 1+, blue being no demand, and gray being areas that there's demand but not well-served. So hopefully I've answered the questions that were put out for the panel, but I'll just recap. The successful transition from the local exchange monopoly to intermodal competition means that COLR is no longer necessary to ensure universal service, especially as the state and federal government are investing billions of dollars to extend broadband deployment to unserved and underserved areas of the state. The prohibition against redlining applies to all telephone corporations, not just COLRs. Universal service does not need to delineate basic service. As California customers have proved, all that is needed is a voice grade line with access to 911. Access to broadband internet, access to interconnected VoIP services permit that access to 911 and a voice grade line. In these decisions, we think the commission should start with the National Broadband Map to determine where alternatives exist. And finally, a redesignation of COLR should not be necessary. The network is the hard part. It will remain. And if a provider goes out of business, that network will remain there and be purchased by another provider. I've used probably more than 10 minutes. I would love to answer the questions you posed, especially the technology neutrality in the copper. I have certain views on that, but it's not my turn, so.
Appreciate that, and we will have some time for Q&A after, and we will, I'm sure, get to those questions.
Got it. Okay. Is this working? That's a good? Okay. Good morning. Let's see if mine wants to load up. As they're looking for it, I will go ahead and start. Tracy Ryan with the Rural Counties. I'm going to move over. I'm getting blinded there. Having technical problems. Okay, sorry. Tracy Ryan with the Rural County Association. While he loads that up, I have been with RCRC for 9 years, working on telecom issues as well as land use issues and fire-related issues. So RCRC represents 40 counties, 40 of the most rural counties. And our counties are home to 1 in 7 Californians, and we represent half of California's landmass. Rural communities are rich in resources. We are the watershed for California in the north part of the state, and represent many other recreational districts. Rural communities typically have lower population densities, lower median incomes, and significantly higher risks of fire. All but one of the COLR providers is represented in RCRC counties, just to tell you the breadth. Thank you. Where are we? Oops, wrong way. There we are. There is the map the PUC put together of the COLRs throughout the state. And as I said, all but one are represented in our counties. Our counties are all the way from the north part of the state, the border, all the way down to Imperial. And nope. Looks like one of my slides are missing. That's okay. So one of the slides that I wanted to have up there is about the characteristics of rural areas. And I think it's important to remember in the context of the COLR conversation who we are. We lack adequate infrastructure. And I don't mean just telecommunications. I think water, sewer, energy in particular is problematic. And we lack redundancy because it is so hard to build in our areas. And you see that over and over with telecommunications and energy in particular. Energy reliability is a challenge. We have the public safety power shutoffs. We have the fast trip outages, which are more difficult because we can't plan. We can't get the generators ready. We can't plug in our old rotary phone to make that work. Propensity for natural disasters. 9 of the 10 largest wildfires were in RCRC counties. Challenging terrain and topography. Mountainous, obviously, forested. Siskiyou County is 60% federal land, all forested. Disadvantaged communities. When people think about disadvantaged communities, they usually think about urban areas and air quality, but there are other ways to be disadvantaged. And if you look at rural counties, one of the basic things, 5 of our counties is not part of a community college district. They don't have access to community colleges in a formal way that most counties do. Affordability challenges. We know everything's harder to build when you're going over granite or mountains. That makes it hard to build. We have workforce shortages, makes those costs go to the customer. So that's who RCRC is. And so on to the questions that were put forth to us today. And like others here, I don't think I'll be able to get to all of them in the time. But I think the foundational components of this conversation are really about how do we ensure every Californian has access to telephony services, and what should we, at a minimum, have those services look like. And I think those are the difficult questions, right, that spurred Kohler and why we had that regime in the beginning. And I think that those services are essential for policy decisions today. So if we're going to start at an agreed understanding that there should be universal service, that every resident should have access to 911, should have access to communications, then I think we get to a point that there needs to be a mechanism to compel service. I don't have a lot of answers. I have more questions than probably answers, unfortunately. But I do think that that is the foundational question, is how do we ensure that that happens, and what does that mechanism look like? And I may have an unpopular opinion up on this panel, but I don't know that that needs to be a line to your house. It just needs to be as reliable as, frankly, in my area, the copper line is. And I think the issue too is that I don't know that technology for rural areas is there yet to ensure that we have that type of reliability from something that is other than a hard line to your house. We need to make sure that any service that we rely upon has those minimum basic standards. Access to 911, backup power. The backup power rules currently are limited to Tier 2 and Tier 3 in high fire areas. However, as most know, the State Fire Marshal just put out new fire maps in the last three years for unincorporated areas, in the last couple months for city and incorporated areas, and if you don't know it, most of the state's ready to burn. So in addition, we have those other things like earthquakes, tsunamis, floods. So when I talk about backup power, I think it is something worth discussing, that it may not be something that needs to be limited, but maybe something that's available throughout the state. So specifically on the question about well-served areas that was put before us today, I think it's important to ensure, by checking and verifying independently by the commission, that service is not only available but reliable in each location. And I think that goes to the discussion about maps that Commissioner Reynolds brought up. I agree, the work has been done on the FCC map, but I can tell you just from my own personal experience in looking at my home there, it is not accurate. And I think I'm probably not the only one. So and especially when we're talking about wireless technology, it's, I think, imperative that we ensure that it's not only available, but actually works in those areas. I think all of us have had a call dropped here and there, even in urban areas. For rural folks, I have to go get on one foot at the top of my driveway to make my cell service work. So even in those well-served areas, though, we get back to that mechanism for ensuring that there's that obligation to serve and that it's reliable and affordable. In the areas where there's no population, no customer, I do understand where the Kohler providers are coming from that. I do have concerns on how we work out if there is a development in the area. And normally when there's large developments, when we talk about urban areas, there's development agreements. They bring in telecommunication as part of that. In rural areas, development doesn't work like that. Development is one house, 4 houses, it's a big development. Those aren't economies of scale where we can have an agreement to have maybe cable come in. And so there may not be anybody in the area now, but there are requirements throughout the state for every jurisdiction to plan to build for their regional need. And so housing will continue to be built, and we need to have a plan for how we serve those people. And then also how we address wildfire rebuilds, areas like Paradise, Pacific Palisades, Altadena, where at one point, I'm guessing in those census blocks, there was no customers left, right? It's because there's no service, no customers, but it doesn't mean they don't want to rebuild. So just looking at making sure that, again, going back to that mechanism, that everybody has access. We are supportive of modernization, and we've been very clear about that for years. We just don't want to leave anyone behind. And I think that we can create a scheme in which the commission ensures that service meets minimum standards in the well-served areas, and make sure that no one is left behind. I think we can find consensus around that. It would need to be a process that goes through the PUC, that there's adequate oversight, that there's consumer protections, that there's benchmarks and accountability metrics involved in it. before anybody's service is shut off. I think the most difficult piece, as I said, is just ensuring that there is access and that no one is left behind. Thank you.
So I'll just chime in a little bit on a few of the comments so far. So I believe that everyone has the best of intent here, but the maps are just plain old not accurate, period, full stop. I'm very comfortable with the effort the SCC has put into the broadband serviceable locations as data points for places that should be served and validated on probably an address-by-address basis. But even AT&T's maps now show more than one alternative in Catalina, for example. Not true, period. And in the previous proceeding, supposedly you could get service on a mooring from the cable company out in the middle of the harbor. So we need to do better. We can't use that. Census blocks are a huge challenge. You can go around a corner or a bend and lose coverage due to terrain and topology if wireless. And so all those things are serious. And Tracy's point on developments, both rural and suburban, the Orange County map, for example, has Orange County Great Park as no demand. I know for a fact Orange County is looking at putting in low-income housing there. So those areas all have to be looked at and accommodated for. It's highly likely that a broadband provider will want to come in and cable that. That's okay. But the onesies, twosies, foursies, we've seen people that have been hit up with massive construction costs to be able to access broadband or voice or anything like that. So I think those are really important things. And just the final thing on the opening slide from AT&T on the 5 out of 100, I challenge that. I challenge that if that's accurate, because I personally tried to order 2 phone lines in Catalina, and it was virtually impossible. I finally got one installed at my house there. I had to escalate to a government affairs office to get an 800 number to the president's office with a PIN code to order a phone line. The second line was never delivered. So I'm not here to, pick on anyone, but I mean, these are the realities of folks in these locations. And even if it is available, then if you're a business, it's not financially viable. So until we have a solution for that, I don't think we can just blanket relinquish it, and I don't think we can rely on the so-called maps for that. And I'll just close with, to your point on your tippy toe in your driveway getting a cell phone signal. Is that good enough? I mean, if you're in bed at night, 911, and you smell smoke, shouldn't your phone work in the back room of your house, in your bedroom? I mean, those are the important things that we can't get to with the current maps as they stand for wired or wireless, and they don't even take into account the failure of the closest tower. These are all best served closest tower things. So what is the next one? How far away is that? What frequency is that? All those things. So those are the things I'd like to see resolved, and then we can actually move forward on how to phase out copper pods, et cetera. So thank you.
Good morning again. Patrick Rossfall here for Consolidated. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Carlos Jennings for helping organize this panel. So I have just the one slide, which I'll dive into in a second, but first I wanted to provide some history of Consolidated first, because I think it's illustrative of kind of the evolution in the telecommunications market and how the Commission has responded to those changes by updating its regulations. So as I mentioned earlier, Consolidated was a small LEC, a rural telephone company, no different than the other rural telephone companies today. It was an agricultural area. Company was founded in 1914, and at that time, in and around Roseville, there were a lot of orchards and ranches and other things. It's 30 miles from Sacramento, which at the time was quite some ways. It then became the location of a pretty important Southern Pacific Railroad depot, which is still kind of there residually. You can see in downtown Roseville, there's a pretty significant train station. Over time, of course, Roseville and Citrus Heights became bedroom communities for Sacramento, and the greater metropolitan Sacramento area expanded. And so did the suburban kind of sprawl through that area. So Consolidated, which was Roseville Telephone at the time, went into Granite Bay and other areas of Sacramento County, grew its footprint. During all of that time, it was still regulated as a rate of return carrier, and that made sense because it was the only game in town for 80 years. Well, then along came the Telecom Act. AT&T was broken up, the Telecom Act came along, there are CLECs all of a sudden that are competing, picking off business customers, doing other things. And the commission responded to that. They created something called the new regulatory framework, which was a price cap structure that applied to Consolidated, Frontier, and AT&T. And so then things continued to evolve. Suddenly you have very ubiquitous wireless coverage. Then you have in around 2004, the kind of issues with VoIP were solved in terms of prioritizing the signals. Suddenly VoIP is proliferating over cable networks. The commission responded to that by creating the Uniform Regulatory Framework in 2006 and then built on that through some other decisions. So at each step of the way, the technology was evolving, competition was expanding, and the commission was loosening its regulations. And I would submit that, you know, we've come actually much further than that. IRF was, you know, now 19 years ago. And COLA relief is the next step in that evolution. And I think I'll provide some facts here about consolidated circumstances, but what I think you'll see is that this is sort of a case study in an area that should be the low-hanging fruit example. It happens that this is our entire service territory and has these competitive dynamics. And I'm not here for any other company, but I think that we would find if we looked at California more generally, there would be other areas like this. There'd be some in LA, there'd be some in the Bay Area. And you could continue looking at them and see that these dynamics are probably present in significant markets, and we should be able to see that COLA obligations don't make sense in those kinds of scenarios. Okay, so what are we looking at here? So my clients like to torment me being red-green colorblind by creating documents that are red and green. Nevertheless, what you're looking at here is the wireline coverage in the entirety of Consolidated's footprint. So that's Roseville, Granite Bay, Citrus Heights, part of Rockland, part of Orangevale, a little bit of Sacramento County. This is a flat area, a little bit of foothills toward Folsom Lake, but basically flat. Wireless has very strong signals. It has 100% coverage. That's what the maps show. That's been our experience. Every single customer, every single location on this map can get multiple wireless carriers, the big three plus however many others there are. We don't have any reason to believe that coverage would be unreliable in an area like this because of the topography. But what you're looking at here is actually not the wireless coverage. This is the wireline coverage derived from the FCC's broadband map. And so you're looking at an area that the green areas, the dark green, those are all households that are fully served by another wireline carrier. The light green are just like parks, cemeteries, and trails and other things where there isn't a location. The red dots, which you can see sprinkled kind of throughout, are the places that we know of, according to the map, that are only served by Consolidated's copper. In other words, only Consolidated's facilities. So what you can see, the numbers are pretty staggering. There's 94,000 households on this page, and you can see the green is like filled in like you took a marker to the map. But this was actually produced by generating the locations of those 94,000 households, the proportion that are served by Comcast or Wave. Astound is the other provider. So there's only 287 out of the 940,000, according to this map, that are served only by Consolidated's network. And that's pretty astonishing, especially since every single one of these households also has access to 3 wireless carriers. On top of that, 90% of these households have access to a fixed wireless option. So there's Cal.net in the area, there's a T-Mobile fixed wireless option, there's a Verizon product, there's actually 6 or 7 of them. And collectively, they add up to 90% on their own. That's not even depicted on this map. Comcast alone serves 97.5% of the customer locations. So just on the basis of Comcast alone, they serve almost everything. And it's also just worth pausing for a minute to note who we're talking about here. Comcast is 250 times larger than, 2.5 times larger than Consolidated nationally, So, sorry, I actually had it right the first time, 250 times bigger. So, and T-Mobile's 100 times bigger, and AT&T's 200 times bigger. And so you're talking about a company that has roots in the community and grew up, as a small EC and eventually got to this point, but is sort of besieged on all sides by much bigger competitors. And so the question that I think is presented by this proceeding is, why should Consolidated have to have the COLA obligation? And I'm not suggesting that it should be applied to Comcast. What I'm suggesting is when you look at an area like this, there shouldn't be one. There doesn't need to be one. And there's certainly issues in rural areas. I want to acknowledge what Ms. Ryan said. We don't serve any rural areas. And there are other places in the state where there aren't any rural areas. So that's a separate issue, and I think AT&T rightly acknowledged that it may require a different treatment. But I hope that there's some acknowledgement of what these dynamics mean for a company like Consolidated, who's much smaller than its competitors and who's facing pretty ubiquitous competition. And the numbers show what this has meant to the Consolidated. The high water mark for access lines was 2004. They had 134,000 access lines. Now look at 2025, they have 11,000. So they're starting to look like a small LEC again if you look at the access lines, size-wise. And you know, that's a combination of factors. It's the availability of wireless. It's people relying on broadband instead of second lines to some degree. So there's a lot of dynamics that go into that, but the biggest factor is cord cutting and competitive alternatives. And a lot of the business customers have regional relationships with Comcast or others. And so they're gonna go with somebody that they have the more regional relationship with in many cases. So I want to turn to your questions. I'm not even sure how much time I'm burning up here, but I'll try to run through them, and happy to answer your other questions as well. I'm going to at least answer one of them, but happy to try to answer as many as there's time for. So I guess the first question that was posed to the panel is, you know, what do we do about potential redlining in an environment where there's no COLR? So I'll just start by saying I don't think that's not a concern that I've seen in an area like this. We serve every location. So, you know, it's not something that is likely to be an issue. But to the extent that someone wants to know what would we do if something happened, I think AT&T rightly said there's statutes on the books that apply whether you're a COLR or not. There's Public Utilities Code 451, which talks about just and reasonableness in rates. There's Public Utilities Code 453, which talks about no preferences or no discrimination. So if there were evidence of somebody, for example, saying, I'm gonna intentionally not serve this low-income area over here, the commission does have enforcement abilities. There would be something that could be done about it, but you'd have to see the data and have to see that it's truly something that's happening. In our area, I don't see that that's something that's happening at all or is likely to happen. To the question about what data should we use, I think the broadband maps from the SEC are a great starting point. I'm totally open to parties suggesting that those may be overstated in certain respects, but I think we should also acknowledge they may be understated. And our experience is that in Consolidated's area, and you know, you can see there's only 287 of these red dots. We can actually go and see what they are, and we are doing that. And we're finding that many of them are not actually locations. So imagine like a big bathroom somewhere that looks like it could be a residence, but actually isn't. We can go and find that that's not really a customer location. That's just a facility that looks like a structure. Some of these are actually businesses too that may not be allowing access to us for various reasons. So, you know, if we're going to start going down that path, I will say that we believe when we're done culling through this list that we're going to be down to something like 100, if that. And so we're going to find that it actually cuts the other way. So, but I think, you know, going one by one is not the right approach in an area like this. And what I would say to those who think the map isn't accurate or is overstated, I would say this data would have to be massively wrong for the dynamics to be such that COLA relief shouldn't be an option. I mean, it'd have to be so wrong from what we're seeing here that it's just very, very unlikely, and we don't need to go to every single household to reach that determination. The question about basic service, I'll just answer the question this way. You don't need a broadband connection of 100/20 or 25/3 even to get a VoIP connection. Our understanding is you can get a pretty good one at 4.1. So that means all DSL connections, and we provide DSL to every single household, all the green dots and the red dots. Every single one of those households can buy our broadband-only service and access any VoIP product in the world. So whether it's fiber or copper or otherwise. So I'll answer the question that way. As far as mobile providers, I guess I may leave that to AT&T to address further, but one could spot test in these areas. In a flat area like this, it's very unlikely that the coverage is radically wrong. Obviously, in rural areas, there's other dynamics, but I think there's no reason to mistrust wireless coverage in a flat agricultural type or suburban type area. And finally, I guess two other things. The redesignation concept. I would just say that if something radically changes, the commission will have the data to take the appropriate steps. It really is no different than the story I told earlier. Dynamics changed, and the commission went from rate of return to NERF. Then they changed again. The commission went from NERF to IRF. Now we're at a different point. We're thinking that it makes sense to go from IRF plus COLA relief. If something changes again, the commission will have the data to make a choice. And that's the way I would view it. We don't need to anticipate that. And I guess to your competitive neutrality question, and I'll stop there, I would just reiterate that why does it make sense in an environment like the one I've explained for Consolidated to be stuck with the COLA obligation when Comcast is there, Wave and Astound are there, there's all these wireless carriers there, fixed wireless is there. It does create a disparity, and it's one that has market consequences, especially for a smaller provider. And the solution isn't to force something more on them. The solution is to lift it for us. So I'll stop there.
Good morning. I'm going to go through the order of the questions that staff posed, and I think they will address some of Commissioner Reynolds' questions as well. Question 1, what happens if you eliminate the carrier of last resort obligation? What are the implications of that? The COLA requirement is about the requirement to serve customers, regardless of where they live, whether it's urban, whether it's rural, whether they're rich, whether they're poor, whoever these people are, they're entitled to receive service. If there's no legal obligation to serve, then there is no guarantee that everyone can get service. And going back to, AT&T's position has been people have been abandoning their landline service. We think it's the other way around. AT&T abandoned its customers. It chose not to maintain its network. It has refused customer requests for landline service. It's refused customer requests to repair service. In 2010, inadequate maintenance of the largest two telephone companies in California, which at the time were Verizon and AT&T, resulted in massive outages for telephone service here in the Los Angeles area. The conduits were not pressurized, so service failed. And then to point the finger, oh, it's bad service, so we have to get out of this. Well, people would have kept their landline service in Lake County if it had been maintained and repaired. The second question, if you were to determine that they were no longer necessary in areas well served by alternative voice or broadband providers, what data and parameters should be used to make that determination? We have a few parameters, 7 off the top of my head. First is that there should be no discriminatory treatment of customers, neighborhoods, and communities. Every COLA in this state has benefited from the fact that they were the dominant monopoly company. They control the poles. They either jointly own the poles or they own them in their entirety, and they control access to the communication space on those poles and probably conduit. I don't know about the conduit, but the poles for sure. So that is a massive benefit. The use of public rights-of-way is a massive benefit. The second point is reliability. And there are a couple of aspects of reliability. First is power in the network. Now, we applaud what the commission did in requiring 72 hours of backup power for high and moderate fire threat areas. And the legislature echoed that in Senator McGuire's legislation on isolation outage reporting, but it's not good enough if you're looking for a carrier of last resort alternative, because you have seismic zones. This entire stretch of coast, some of the most populated area in the world here and in the north, is sitting smack dab in the middle of major seismic areas where power can be out for many days. We had a citation in one of our filings in this docket that following Loma Prieta, the power was out for a significant time in downtown San Francisco due to concerns about damage to the gas lines. Well, who lives there? For one thing, people in Chinatown packed into single residence occupancy hotel rooms. They keep their landlines. You cannot assume that this only should apply to high and moderate fire threat areas. The second thing is there are areas that are designated as urban that are really kind of small that are in massive seismic zones. And I'm thinking off the top of my head, Fortuna, Eureka, and Arcata, sitting smack dab in the middle of the Mendocino Triple Junction, land of quite frequent earthquakes with the magnitudes of over 6. Last year it was 7. So are those higher moderate fire threat areas? They may or may not be. You'd have to check the maps. But you need to be able to communicate regardless of whether you're in one of those areas whenever there's a power outage. If you're snowed in for 2 weeks and the power's out for a long period of time, you need to be able to communicate. So those rules, we know the docket has just been closed. We encourage you to pursue these issues and to expand those backup power requirements so that we can ensure that Californians have reliable everything, including communication. Okay. The next thing is, if I turn the page correctly, fixed wireless reliability. We need to verify, do fixed wireless services rely on an ILEC wireless affiliates network or spectrum or anybody else's wireless network or spectrum? That is a problem. If a cell site goes down, traffic is routed through the remaining sites. And if 2 go down, then it's routed through the remaining sites. And that can cause network congestion to make the service unusable. And I can provide some specific examples of that if you wish. Reliability, again, is reliable service indoors. If you have a heart attack, if you have an emergency, you need to be able to call 911. And if you can't get a signal, you can't call. Okay, the next point with the parameters is location-based 911. That is providing emergency communication centers with the location of a caller. Accurate location information should be required if a substitute service is going to be considered as an adequate replacement, and the Commission needs to verify this, and I'll get to this in a little more on that in a second. The next thing is affordability. Does the customer retain the option to purchase an affordable voice service? The FCC very recently acted quite quickly in response to a US telecom petition and paused the requirement that broadband should be offered with a standalone voice requirement. So customers would have to be purchasing a bundled offering if that was their alternative. So, question, do the suggested alternatives allow customers to purchase standalone voice? If not, are the bundled offers affordable? Are the low-income support programs sufficient to ensure that people can actually get the service? On a broadband connection that's not offered by an ILEC or a CLEC, including cable companies, as CLECs, a voice service is provided by purchasing an over-the-top voice service like Vonage or Skype, which is an additional expense. And a next criteria is it's got to be compatible with equipment used by people with disabilities. Next, are the identified alternatives capable of serving all customers? Are they really available? First, service today from a caller is provided on an exchange basis, not a census block and not a census block group. So you have to make sure that everybody can still have an alternative. The next thing is that the incumbent telephone companies have a major advantage over alternative owners and operators of fixed networks. They've been the only game in town for a long time. They were able, with loads and loads of public support and ratepayer money, to build out their networks to serve all customers in their territory. Alternative providers of fixed service have obstacles to overcome if they are going to be able to serve everyone. One of these is the pole control issue. They have to go through the incumbent carrier who controls the communication space in order to get access to those poles. You have a big record on those issues in another docket or two, describing the difficulties with this. The next thing is uni forbearance. Because of FCC action taken at the behest of US Telecom, the FCC is phasing out the requirement that AT&T and the other large former RBOC ILECs provide unbundled uni loops to competitive carriers in urban and suburban markets. That has been used as an entree by companies like Sonic to say, we're going to go serve your community. But you know what? We're building our fiber network. We can't build it to everybody in the next 5 seconds. And so we're going to lease these loops. And as we use these loops to build out, we can serve the entire community. Well, they're not going to have that anymore. The FCC also forbore from enforcing the dark fiber uni. That is very important for people wishing to expand broadband or voice, carrying traffic from major locations to other locations. So those things are gone, and these are the types of things that do pose obstacles for competitive alternatives. Okay, question 3. Does access to broadband internet ensure access to the basic service that the COLRs are obligated to provide? Our thinking is there's 4 ways to get broadband. A broadband connection by itself, through VoIP provided by an ILEC or a CLEC, which is different than broadband by itself, solely a broadband connection, fixed wireless, or broadband provided by a cell phone company. For all of these options, backup power and networks and the customer premises, which is the thorny question, that's a major concern. For fixed VoIP, as discussed above, there's affordability issues because you're no longer required to just provide a basic standalone service. It would be offered through a bundle. You also need to identify the exchange boundary issue. Are all customers going to be served? And the third question with that, is the provider going to be there for the long haul? And I think that gets to Commissioner Reynolds' question, what happens with consolidation or somebody fails? We don't know what happens. The carriers that Mr. Disher referred to were serving the business community. They bought up the fiber. Where are all the people who used unis and they were going to jump into the market like MCI? They don't exist anymore. They were gobbled up. But when you look at the pleadings filed by these companies, you'll see 10 different entities because they all have the separate CPCNs and they were all acquired by somebody. They're not serving residential customers. They may or may not be serving small businesses that are also covered by COLR. So you don't know. So for a broadband connection alone, how does the customer receive the voice service? And especially the location issue. With a wireline broadband connection not provided by an ILEC or CLEC, it's going to be available through over-the-top VoIP, and there's a massive 911 concern. Under the FCC rules, non-fixed interconnected VoIP service only provide dispatchable location information if it is quote-unquote technically feasible. If not, they do something else. They provide the information that was inputted by the user, or it can be routed to a national emergency call center as long as the provider made a good faith effort to obtain location data. It's TURN's understanding, and we're still working on this, that over-the-top VoIP providers are not accurately reporting their provision of location-based 911 to the FCC. The Commission needs to verify this. We need to understand if you get service solely from a broadband connection, there is no TDM available, the cable company is not in your area, can you still get that location-based service? Fixed wireless, a major 911 concern. This is from the FCC's 2021 report to Congress at a time when Verizon's Fios service and Verizon Voice Link especially had been in place for quite a while. Here's from the FCC report. Existing Wi-Fi and unlicensed infrastructure typically are not engineered to provide the resiliency and reliability needed to support communications in a major emergency and are likely to be affected by many of the same conditions that impair mobile networks in such circumstances, e.g. power outages, physical damage to infrastructure from storms, floods, or wildfires, and so on. The final option we see for getting a broadband connection are cellular networks. The issues are well documented. Indoor reception, not reliable in many areas, the backup power issue, and there's less accurate 911 information. The FCC released a notice of proposed rulemaking, again addressing wireless location on March 28th of this year, and it stated in part that less than 1% of wireless 911 calls convey location information, and most of the location information is based on coordinates. And there are comments in these dockets from public safety agencies saying that the wireless industry has not implemented even the existing FCC requirements for location information. That is a massive concern, and we need to verify that before assuming that an alternative is acceptable. As to question 4, how should you determine whether it's well served by mobile voice providers? We echo the points that made by RCRC and Equal. You can't rely on the FCC maps. They're not accurate. You should verify it by any means possible. That means, by all means, use them, but use California's maps. Do ground truthing. Allow customers to self-report. The staff should go out and see it for themselves or try it for themselves. There should be field tests. And yes, we do think it should be limited to facilities-based providers or providers that control their own networks. Question 5 is a fascinating question. Should you be allowed to redesignate Kohler if the area becomes no longer well served by alternatives? Yes, but how do you do that once the horse is out of the barn? Do you have the authority to say to a carrier, thou shalt become a carrier of last resort because we said so? Do you, that's an open question. There may be ways to encourage that. We do think that the B fund should be revised, that there are places where there needs to be additional support, but tackling that B fund, is another exercise in and of itself. So I think that's all I have.
Thank you to all of our panelists for presenting. We're going to kick off a Q&A now from our moderation table, and I want to kick off with a question that I'll direct to AT&T primarily, although I do want to hear from all of the panelists. You outlined in your presentation that just 5% of the households take basic service, yet you have to continue to maintain a network that could support the entire 100 households if they were to request service. And I want to probe that position.
Okay.
If the infrastructure, the advanced communications networks are already there, why aren't you simply using those networks as your source of delivering Kohler service so that you don't have to maintain legacy infrastructure for 100 households and you simply use modern infrastructure to support all 100 households? And if it's 5 customers who are on basic service, they're still using the modern network. If it's 90 customers who are on basic service, they're all still using the modern networks.
I believe part of the answer is in your question, which is if. If we have fiber to all 100 households, that's not true. We don't. When the Kohler was started in 1996, copper was the technology. The commission at that time debated, what's the forward-looking technology that we should cost to figure out the costs of service, to figure out CHCFB? And there was a debate on that issue, and copper was the forward-looking network. That's what exists. That's what is built. Yes, we, AT&T, are building fiber, but it doesn't get to anywhere close to those 100 households. So that's the first problem with that. The second problem, so if you were to start as a scorched earth, right, and what's the forward-looking technology, it probably wouldn't be copper. But that's not where we are today. We don't get the opportunity of a scorched earth. Then you have the issue of the basic service definition. I hear, oh, it's intended to be technology neutral. You can say that, but in reality, it isn't that. Because at the table there was a list of the basic service elements. There's one that's incredibly important, which is ILECs have to offer pre-subscription. Does anybody even remember what that is? But that I mean, wireless doesn't offer it. Our wireless, no, I don't know of any wireless that offers pre-subscription. I don't know of any VoIP provider that offers pre-subscription. Okay, so maybe you solve some of those elements that look like basic service is not technology neutral to make it technology neutral. But as soon as you call it basic service, you have to tariff it. And then right then, it's not technology neutral. No wireless carrier tariffs their service. No VoIP provider, they don't tariff their services. So if you say, AT&T, you can use alternative technologies, we'll redefine it, but you have to tariff it, it's automatically not technology neutral.
So I do want to probe a little bit
Sure.
further before we turn to the other panelists. On your first point that you don't have fiber at every household, completely
Right.
appreciated. You also have a wireless affiliate.
Okay.
And I do want to understand why you're not using the wireless network plus the fiber network that you have built. Even if that fiber network doesn't reach the household itself, you surely have fiber portions of the network developed, with perhaps some portion of copper remaining even in a very urban area. And I can say that my household, for example, has AT&T fiber available.
Okay.
If I were to receive basic service, why wouldn't I get basic service using that existing AT&T fiber?
Using fiber. Are you ordering basic service?
I am not. I am a mobile-only household.
Then that's really the answer. Why does there even need to be Kohler?
But I really want to understand where's the efficiency problem here? If you're looking to retire legacy elements of the network, why aren't you retiring legacy elements of the network and moving your service to the advanced networks that you are building and that your affiliates do already hold?
Well, there are a number of reasons. One, we don't think we should have the obligation to provide basic service. Our service doesn't meet the definition of basic service for VoIP. Second, go past your house to where there isn't AT&T fiber. We've got copper out there. That wire probably goes right through your neighborhood, the copper wire. Probably goes right through your neighborhood with the fiber lashed to that copper wire. And so until you get mass relief of the Kohler obligation, you really can't retire your copper.
It sort of sounds like you're saying on the one hand, these communities are well served, and on the other hand, you're saying that there's no network available.
They're well served, maybe not by us. Again, our footprint versus Comcast's footprint versus Time Warner's footprint, our view is you should look at all the alternative networks, and if there is an alternative network there, then that justifies the relinquishment of Kohler.
Yeah.
And when you talk about wireless, as well as broadband, I think RCRC, Turn, and Equal all pointed at a lot of problems with broadband and wireless as the technology for Kohler. They talked about backup power, they talked about redundancy, they talked about resiliency. So I also think that, in our view, those are alternatives. I'm not sure how others view using those technologies as really the only option.
So I also want to touch on the I think, two items that you identified as
Sure.
not technology neutral in the existing basic service rules. You said pre-qualification and tariffing. Why, as a carrier of last resort, can't AT&T California offer a tariffed basic service through an advanced network potentially owned by AT&T California or one of its affiliates, or contracted for with another carrier who has an advanced network in the area?
Well, that wouldn't be technology neutral, because then AT&T would be the only provider that has to tariff its wireless or its broadband service.
There's nothing preventing you from offering a tariffed service that rides on a fiber network or a wireless network, right?
That's nothing preventing us, no.
Okay. I want to turn to our other panelists to hear if they have any responses either to my questions or to Mr. Disher's points.
I'm happy to try to answer your question maybe in a different way, and I'll try to be brief, but I'm going to give you 3 examples. Okay, so, and I think your question, I'm going to repackage it a little by saying, sort of, why does it matter that you'd be given COLA relief? Why do you need it? What does it do for you, in a sense? So I guess the first thing I would say is there's an implication, and I think you're challenging that implication, which I'm happy to hear. There's an implication that if I have a customer with a fiber connection, and then right now there's also a copper line there because historically there was one, and I have that copper line is no longer maintained well enough to deliver service, say DSL service, you know, there's an implication at least that I would have to put in a new copper line if someone asks me for one, if I am a COLA. Now, if the rules are written to make that clear, then maybe that example is no longer there, and that may be part of your point, Commissioner. But I'll give you 2 other examples. So if you just look at my map, okay, so I probably didn't clarify this, but the kind of like cream-colored areas, that's like no man's land, you know? There's trees there or something. The green ones are parks, the light green ones are parks, the dark green ones are locations. So let's say that right on the edge of one of these dark greens, a new thing, you know, there's a redistricting, a rezoning of something. No, there's no longer trees and coyotes there. There's a house. We now have to go serve that house as a COLA. As long as we're a COLA, it's in our exchange, we will have to go serve it. Part of my point is, why should we have to do that? There's all these competitive options. That same house may already be in Comcast territory in the sense that it's right next door to Comcast's facilities. So then my third example, just looking at the map again, there's a neighborhood up there kind of, it's near Serra College Highway. You see a bunch of red dots sort of clustered together. That's a relatively high income area with 3-acre lots, wealthy folks who have these large properties. Let's say another one gets developed right at the end of that neighborhood. You can see that we're the only ones there. Again, why should we have to spend the money to go do that when we're in this competitive environment? So I'm just sort of challenging the premise of your original question by pointing out other reasons why we might need COLA relief. And I do want to double down on the basic service thing too, which is to say that having to provide equal access, which is another way of saying pre-subscription, do white pages and tariffing, nobody else has to do that. So
I definitely get where you're coming from, and I do question, I mean, if there's a household that pops up within the green area, it sounds like 5 out of 100 of those households are going to ultimately subscribe to your service, and therefore you won't have to build to most of those households. I'm really questioning the efficiency gain that you get by not having the obligation, because you won't be building when the customer doesn't ask you for basic service anyways.
I mean, I guess in that last example, I'm saying they did ask us, and we had, that expense may be very big. And by the way, Consolidated hasn't taken any B fund money for 12, 13 years. So there's no subsidy for that. You know, it's not.
There's no subsidy. Those customers may be rare. They could happen. But there is an existing advanced network in that area that you could use to deliver service to that customer. So you wouldn't necessarily be incurring the construction of a new copper loop or maintenance of an existing copper loop to get to that customer.
In that third example, correct, although what I'm trying to say is there's a country road that's going out up through that area. I mean, I say country in the loosest sense of the word. It's not really the country, but it's you know, you may have to extend a line quite a bit down some road and then drop a pretty long loop to get to a 3-acre lot location.
Are you other panelists? Okay. I do want to see if other moderators have questions, and I will have some more after too.
Thank you, Commissioner. Robert Osborne from the Communications Division. So I've seen several broadband maps being displayed, and I'm wondering if this is not a case of apples and oranges. It's interesting that using broadband as a proxy for basic service availability, is that suggesting broadband should be part of basic service is my question, because because there's broadband doesn't mean there's basic service available. So I'm wondering why we're not looking at basic service maps. And one could argue, well, if you have broadband, you could get Skype, but Skype doesn't interconnect with 711. Skype doesn't offer Lifeline. So there's some elements of basic service that we need to see that are available to all Californians that would not necessarily be offered through a broadband provider. So I guess that's not really a question, it's more sort of an observation. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, just since I'm the one that has the slide up with the map, I'll just say, I mean, this is a broadband and voice map in the sense that these are facilities. This is Comcast and Astound. They have a network. So I also pointed out that as to the red dots, anybody in those places can use our service to access Skype or anything else. I mean, so it's not, we don't think that broadband itself is an issue in this proceeding, or should be. I mean, I don't read the scoping memo to be saying that. I read the scoping memo to be saying, let's look at broadband because it enables VoIP, and that is a part of the competitive equation, which I totally understand. But I think when you're looking at physical facilities of a wireline company, which is what this is, it doesn't really matter whether you say voice or broadband. It's both.
I disagree. Neither Comcast nor Astound offers Lifeline. So if I'm a Lifeline customer in your territory and you're no longer obligated to offer Lifeline, what do I do?
You're speaking of voice Lifeline, I assume, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess we would say that's an issue for a long discussion about what the scope of Lifeline ought to be. I mean, and we know there's bills rolling through the legislature on the broadband side this year. The commission has looked at that issue many times. The commission itself made the decision to make Lifeline voluntary for other types of competitive providers. That was the commission's decision. So, I mean, if there's a need for looking at discounts for low-income individuals on a broader basis, that's the place to do that.
I think part of the answer is in my chart here. 95 out of the 100 households get their voice from somebody other than AT&T. So that must give us some confidence that the alternatives shown on these maps have some validity. And as far as the Lifeline is concerned, if you want to look just at focus on the maps for wireless, all the wireless is the very vast predominant provider of Lifeline service. And we've gone through that in the ETC proceeding. The small number of Lifeline customers that AT&T still has. I mean, remember, 5 out of 100 households only have basic from AT&T. How many of them are Lifeline? So I think that this really helps with both understanding where voice is available, and it is. I mean, my kids hate talking on the phone. They love texting. But that's not everybody. People still want to talk on the phone, and all these 95 are getting it from somebody else, from another network. And yes, it could be an AT&T network. It could be a T-Mobile network, a Verizon network. And back to, well, why don't you use AT&T's? Why don't you use mobility? Well, maybe there's a neighborhood that AT&T mobility doesn't get to. Verizon could be there. Comcast could be there. We have to maintain the copper all the way out there, and from our central office all the way out to an area that we might not have fiber, that our wireless might not work, that has 3 alternatives. Kohler would require us to maintain that copper network there.
Couldn't AT&T simply contract with Verizon or T-Mobile if they have a wireless network that reaches those customers so that you don't have to maintain the copper, but you can still deliver voice service over an advanced network?
See, I've never thought about us having to go to that expense that no other, I mean, we like to think of ourselves as a competitor of those companies and want the same burdens and obligations as them. To say, oh, well, AT&T, you have to go negotiate with your competitor so that you can get some other benefit. I just frankly never thought about that as an alternative.
I think, to Commissioner Osborne's part, I think broadband maps personally are a horrible proxy for basic voice service. And if we're still of the mindset, with or without basic service, of feeling that California residents have some level of entitlement to universal service, whatever transport mechanism it takes, that broadband does not serve that purpose, and in part because there's not enough regulation there, and I'm not saying that there should be, to ensure that there's 5 nines of reliability, 4 nines, 2 nines, right? And so what is that threshold where you can say confidently that it is served, assuming it's wired for the moment, forget propagation maps, that that provider has to be up 99.9% of the time? Is that enough? And then the voice over IP provider behind that has to be up 4 nines, 5 nines? So we don't have a tangible way to get there from here. I mean, if we're willing to accept the fact that 50% uptime is great or 90% uptime is great, then yeah, maybe it's a reasonable proxy if that data is validated household by household or broadband serviceable location by location. But we don't have that. And so until we can get to that, especially in some of these harder, more rural areas, we need to define what that is, hopefully maybe through this proceeding, and what that bar is. And maybe as part of that, I'm not disagreeing that basic service is a hard bar to reach, many of which things I don't think people even use anymore, white pages, for example, so that other people might be able to step into that breach and be willing to fill it without having to fulfill a bunch of obligations that consumers don't even need or care about at this moment. And I would like to go back to Regina's point, if I may, briefly on competitors and competitive. Pole attachments or conduit access is a huge thing for people having access, and why should folks that are willing to step in, if others aren't, and be competitive, have to pay for pole replacements where poles are overlaid and copper is hanging there, maybe not even in service or capable of being put into service easily? There are folks that are interested in that, and so that we should look as part of this as to what those transitions would look like if folks were willing to step into that and either keep the copper in place for a time period or replace it with fiber where the ROI doesn't make sense to the current collars. Those are things that I think are important, but I don't think broadband maps currently are a reasonable proxy for the availability of voice service.
Ms. Costa spoke to, I think, a couple of other potential data sources for validating whether or not areas are served by alternative providers. She spoke to, I think, doing on-the-ground speed tests, customer surveys, and I'm curious for all of our panelists, if we were to look to how well served an area is by different types of networks to evaluate whether or not COLR obligations could be relinquished in particular geography, are there some technical data or other similar sources of data that you would suggest we look to in addition to the broadband maps in order to validate that service is really there?
I think that's a fair request. I mean, there's other data out there, UCLA, for example, which you can license by, that maybe give better, deeper indicators, latency and other such things, not necessarily frequent enough to predict outages or 24/7 availability, but certainly that does exist in a broader sense than the FCC is collecting it. And I know California's had some of that data available to it, so there may be some immediate access to that. Also to identify problem areas, regions as a start, and then potentially to partner with someone for network probes or something that can facilitate monitoring of availability, not necessarily to the address or BSL level, but at least get a broad scope that this area may be served by this central office if the desire is to shut down that one is well served, and then you can start moving it out to the edge of where those copper loops go. So I think that it can be solved technically with a fairly high degree of assurance that shutting down this particular CO and letting the COLR out of their obligation will not result in the loss of coverage as the land is currently developed, as the households are currently developed.
I would agree with everything that Lance said. The maps are interesting in that they have max speed, right, available when we're talking about broadband connections in particular. And I thought it was interesting because just looking at my own address, it was completely inaccurate. But I have a number. I have AT&T DSL. I'm old school with AT&T. I have my POTS line. I have fixed wireless. I've had satellite to cobble together some sort of semblance of coverage. And what was reflected on the map was not accurate. But for the services that I did have coverage, which one is my fixed wireless, it said 100/20, and nowhere in this world has that ever occurred with me. And so I think, not only accuracy, and especially with wireless, but I don't know why the metric is best, because it's never best, especially when you talk about if it's cloudy or if it's after 4 o'clock and everybody's on because the kids are doing homework. I only have one, but right, it's the load on the infrastructure that's around you. And maybe that's a paradigm shift and that's more theoretical, but I think that we're talking about the wrong thing if we're saying what the max is. We need to know what the bare minimum service that you're getting there that you're surviving on.
This is a huge source of contention because the FCC essentially allows marketed speeds, maybe best case, maybe not. And even with the new broadband labels, there's no accommodation for minimum speed under load, and there's no true concept of oversubscription of whatever middle mile there may be, let alone the last mile. And so we suffer with this. We see this everywhere. I mean, not just Catalina, but throughout the nation. So a lot more could/needs to be done on that. And the other big metric that's missing in those labels is availability, uptime, right? So it's all marketing, and I spent a fair amount of time talking with the FCC on this matter. Don't think we're going to make too much projects, but I keep getting redirected to the FTC for false advertising, right? And it's just a whole other mechanism to correct someone's, mismarketing of their product. Thanks.
Just real briefly to your question, yes, in an ILEC network, you can test at various locations. I'll just, being a non-engineer, call them nodes. You can pick a location and you can get a pretty decent sense as to what's available at through the distribution from there. It's overkill to test at every customer location because you can test in those locations and have a really good sense. You could also spot check some certain customer locations, but testing every location is not reasonable. As we know, the commission has done spot checking for wireless as well. You can do that. I will just say, to the broader point here, Consolidated provides really good service. The network is highly functional. It is a standalone network. People who live there are lucky to have the service. It's very good service. But for us to compete, there does need to be an even playing field. So part of your question points to measuring competitors, not our network. But the point of our presentation, at least, is that we want to be treated on an even playing field with our true competitors who have far less regulation than us.
Thank you, Regina. I keep raising this because this is, to me, the most important thing, aside from the commitment that AT&T will leave nobody behind. This is reality. 5 out of 100 households in our service territory are buying basic service. That must give us some confidence that the alternatives on these maps have some validity. Of course, you could always go to house by house and say, they say you have Verizon, T-Mo, not AT&T, and Comcast. Do you? You could always do that, but again, what are we gaining? If we have a program to make sure that nobody is left behind, a customer challenge process that comes to AT&T, and we heard you want to withdraw basic service, AT&T. We can't get any wireless service from any of the 3 carriers. We don't have cable. Then we can address that. If you have a process like that, I think that's much more preferable to an idea of trying to survey everybody in a census block to say, the FCC's broadband map says you all have an alternative, do you? And then you get into, well, my AT&T doesn't work. Well, does Verizon work? Well, I don't know. I haven't tried it. I mean, it really gets hard if you try and get down to that level of specificity.
Well, I would submit that that 5 out of 100 is accurate.
I'm sorry.
I worked very hard to get a line installed. I was redirected multiple times. I had to escalate to government affairs to get a phone number with the PIN code. So that is factually incorrect. We don't know if 5 is the right number. It could be 10 out of 100,
Well,
right? I've replaced 80 loops on Catalina Island because you guys have escalated the price to $3,000 a line for businesses. So this is not accurate reflection of demand for voice or POTS.
well, I can get into how I believe it is accurate, but even if it's 10 out of 100, it still tells us a lot about the availability of alternatives, the inequity of a COLR obligation on a single competitor, and the challenges of reaching the outer areas with copper and alternatives. I do want to mention there was an effort by the commission to create their own broadband maps. And the data is old, so that's why we think the national broadband map is preferable. There's so much resource that's been put into that. And one of the things that the commission did, the staff did, was they asked providers, give us your subscription data. You say you serve these addresses, this census block. I can't remember the level that the communications division was going on that, but I remember we got into this problem of turning over subscriber data to the commission and had to get a subpoena for a couple years. That's I'm not as familiar with how the FCC validates. I know there's a validation process, a challenge process. There are ways to do this, but again, how much time should you spend when, whether it's 10 or 5, 90 or 95 households aren't using basic service? Maybe a better process is to make sure nobody is left behind.
To quote Mork from Ork, reality, what a concept. I think if you check the public participation hearing transcripts from the service quality docket, from AT&T's COLR application, from the thousands of public comments that were submitted in response to that application, a lot of people want their landlines and have not been able to either get them or have them repaired and so on and so forth. And we can debate that till the cows come home, and we probably will. But the bottom line is you can't assume that there's a reasonable alternative if you can't verify that there's a real alternative. And, thinking about this, what would happen if, let's just hypothetically say you granted AT&T's proposal for COLR relief for 90% of its territory, and they came in the next day with a blanket thing saying, well, we want to withdraw from all of these places. How do you verify that those people have an adequate replacement? You would have to. I mean, it literally is a matter of life and death. So that's why, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be an expert on the FCC map, the CPUC map, or any other data source. I certainly can't tell you about testing at ILEC nodes, but since they would be the ones wanting to get out of there anyway, I think the more important thing would be, does this so-called alternative actually serve all of the people in this area, and does it do it reliably? I think you make use of anything that you can. Assemblyman Wood had a bill aimed at improving the commission's broadband map, allowing people to self-report their own speeds and service. I can't remember the details of it, whether it was service quality, whether you could actually receive a signal, whatever, but they could at least self-report for particular locations. You would want to make use of that data. I would also say that you would want to consult with, at a minimum, local governments. You sat with the county supervisors from Lake County. You heard from the Mendocino County Sheriff. Those are the people who know whether or not something truly is available for everybody in their area. And as for the notion that, well, nobody lives there, well, you've got an exchange. You have wire centers. They were there for a reason. Maybe somebody's there, maybe they're not. But again, consult with the local authorities because they're the people who know who is where. I, like Tracy, live in one of those places in rural Sonoma County. The volunteer fire department went through there. They have a list of every single residence and business in that rural area. They know who lives there. They verify whether it's a vacation home, whether it's a full-time, blah, blah, blah. Those are the people who know. And I'm sorry, just let us out, but no, there's no way you can possibly verify that the service actually works, so don't worry your pretty little head about it, is not the right answer, and it's not something that should be acceptable.
I hope that we can have some further exploration in the course of this proceeding of different data sources that we could use to evaluate the service levels of different services, not merely the ILEC services, the carrier of last resort services, but competitors and their availability in an area. I appreciate we're a touch of our time, but I do want to offer one more brief question for Mr. Disher. And I do appreciate the commitment in this docket to leaving no one behind. And I also appreciate some of the statements that I've heard reflecting that there's a difference between having a COLA obligation and exiting a market. And I would like to understand how you square that position with a statement made by AT&T CEO John Stankey at the SEC in one of your earnings reports last year. That is, so where I've got small numbers of data customers in place, I need to get them off of fixed infrastructure that I ultimately want to shutter, because that allows me to turn down a geography that is a low utilization geography and a low profitable geography on the fixed side. And I can turn out the lights, walk away, take cost out of business. I will do that. Could you please square the commitment to not leaving anyone behind with that statement?
Sure. You know, I've talked about how we have to maintain the copper network for those last 5, whether it's 5 or 10. And that network basically doesn't serve anybody except plain old telephone service customers. So all of the costs of that separate copper network are borne by those customers. It's not, we don't get subsidies from the rest of California to do that. As if we believe there's an alternative and the commission agrees there's an alternative, I think it's appropriate that there would be a process, and it would appropriately be at the time that AT&T sought to withdraw the service. I mean, if you still have the service but you're not a COLR and you have a tariff for the service, you can't say no. You can't say you have to get off. It would come at the time that you attempted to withdraw the service. I would assume that there would be customer notice. The commission has an extensive customer notice process when a CLEC exits, and a discussion about whether there's a migration, a forced migration, a voluntary migration, and I don't know, 2 or 3 customer notices with like saying alternatives that are available, and you could use that process to say, AT&T, we're doing what Mr. Stankey said, and we're turning off your service in 90 days. Here are what we believe your alternatives are. If you don't think you have an alternative, contact us. I guess they probably can't use the internet at their house, so I guess they'd have to call us, so maybe there'd have to be an 800 number. But maybe they could do it from work or something, and there'd be some process, I think, that the customer could come to AT&T and say, you've said I have an alternative in this notice. I don't, and we could work with that customer to make sure. I mean, we're doing it, we would be turning off the service because we believe truly there is an alternative. We really do not want to leave anybody behind. So if we're wrong, we're wrong, but if we're right, we would like that opportunity to help that customer find that alternative. I hope that helps.
I appreciate that, and I do appreciate the commitment to leaving no one behind. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. Thank you all.
Lunch. Our challenge now is to keep you awake. This next panel is going to focus on affordability. So with us today, the panel we have is Janice Norman from California Broadband, Itzel Hayward from the Small Business Utility Advocates, We also have Rachel Sweetman from C4AT, Communication Access, sorry, Center for Affordable Accessible Technology. Thank you. I always forget that acronym. And then Beelan Follensby from US Telecom. Great. So I'm going to start off just with a couple comments, and then I'm going to hand it off to Janus, if you don't mind starting. Oh, no, sorry, we're going to start with Rachel. Got it. We'll start with Rachel with the slides. Thank you. So just wanted to start off by with a couple words. One of the existing challenges we have with when we're talking about affordability in communication services is that often affordability is confused with income qualified plans, and those are two different things, obviously. So there's low income, and then there's affordability, and often the social service programs that we have available to people who are low income are based on the federal poverty level. And as you know pretty well, in California, that doesn't capture a lot of population in California because we have a higher cost of living. So it was back in 2023, the California Budget and Policy Center reported in September, actually they reported last year on 2023, saying that they estimated the adjusted poverty level for California was 18.9%. So it's almost 20%. And it was disproportionately high among Black and Latino households. So when we're talking about affordability, we have to be clear about what we're trying to achieve for what target population, what segment of the population. At the PUC, we've adopted a number of factors to look at what we call disadvantaged communities, and one of those looks at median household income. And the greater of the two, either the statewide median household income or the county, depending on which is higher, 80% is the cutoff. So I just wanted to reiterate that before we start off to kind of set the stage for affordability. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rachel.
Thank you. Sorry. I'm Rachel from Center for Accessible Technology, or C4AT. We represent customers with disabilities and medical needs. Our constituents are more likely to be low income, and they depend on access to reliable and affordable communication services for their health and safety and to maintain their ability to live independently. For this population and customers more broadly, the COLR rules are important for ensuring universal affordable service. So I'll start by discussing some existing challenges impacting affordability of communication services and COLR services. First, pricing. With pricing, we see that of the COLRs, AT&T has had the highest basic rate for a decade, and that rates have increased without a corresponding increase in service. At last week's workshop, speakers from local government discussed that some of their constituents have been priced out of COLR service. These customer experiences are consistent with findings in the network exams of AT&T and Frontier. The network study found that AT&T's rate increases are part of a harvesting strategy to maximize revenue from POTS customers while their marketing and service quality for POTS have declined. And there have been efforts to migrate customers away from POTS. This is explained by the gains that can be realized by raising prices while reducing investment and maintenance in POTS exceed the penalties for poor service quality. And customers experience rising prices, yet declining service quality, and the areas with the lowest POTS drop-off rates have experienced the steepest decline in service quality. AT&T and Frontier have also been disinvesting in their local networks. AT&T's paying dividends to its parent company that exceeds total net income, and Frontier has also been engaging in substantial disinvestment, and they've been engaging in inter-affiliate transactions that are not at arm's length. This impacts access to affordable and reliable service because investments that could be made in improving Kohler service or lowering prices to consumers are not happening. Given these challenges, the revised Kohler rules should avoid anything that could degrade affordability and seek to improve affordability for customers. Under the current rules, the requirement to participate in California Lifeline ensures that all customers have access to at least some subsidy. This requirement is necessary to make basic service more affordable. If this requirement were to be eliminated from providers with duty to serve, that could strand low-income households without an affordable option for service. There are also potential additions that could improve affordability, such as an affordability requirement to ensure that prices are just and reasonable. Disaster relief requirements should also be integrated into the Kohler rules to provide billing protections during times of emergency. And lastly, the disinvestment trend could be reversed by requiring non-Kohler affiliates to invest in Kohler service. This would ensure that there's proper investment in infrastructure, maintenance, and personnel, and incentivize transition to newer technologies. In determining affordability, these are some data and parameters that the Commission could consider. They're the Commission's affordability metrics, including the affordability ratio, hours worked at minimum wage, and CalEnviroScreen metric. The Commission could also evaluate data on how long it takes to obtain Kohler service, including the sign-up process and installation versus other technologies. And they could also survey customers regarding the affordability, including whether a customer has considered purchasing service, if not, why not, and if yes, how long they have had it. Next, I'll discuss some differences across customer bases. So first, it's important to recognize that many low-income households are not choosing wireless over wireline services, but rather can only afford one. As mentioned earlier, people with disabilities are more likely to be low income, and in the disability community as broadly, poverty rates also vary across race and ethnicity. So there are important equity issues to consider for evaluating affordability. People with disabilities and complex medical needs often use equipment that is incompatible or only partially compatible with wireless and VoIP services. And so these individuals have extremely limited choices for providers. Next, as discussed last week and earlier, there are challenges with wireless versus wireline in both rural and urban areas. Wireless doesn't work inside for a lot of folks, and wireless customers, some experience a lack of reliability despite paying to reach the network where they live, work, and travel. And lastly, the trends to monitor in considering future affordability include whether there are improvements in service offerings and the trend towards market exit and consolidation. As depicted in this visual, there's an industry trend towards this over time, and for customers, this tends to mean higher prices and lower service quality. And I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
I'll go next. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lynn Follensby, and I represent U.S. Telecom. And just so you know, lay of the land, U.S. Telecom is a national trade association that represents a wide swath of providers. We used to be called the U.S. Telephone Association, so our members, differentiated from cable and others, are in fact the original telephone companies that are now broadband providers and who are typically impacted by COLA requirements and who, basically built the old networks that have been around for 150 years. So more than a generation ago, there was essentially only one voice provider in the state, and there was this compact, as others have mentioned, that the provider and with that provider, and it placed COLA rules on the provider in exchange for a guaranteed customer base. At least in part, COLA rules and the basic service definition were intended to ensure that all Californians would have access to affordable voice communications. The telecom industry has been transformed over the past 3 decades by competition, the introduction of widespread availability of new technologies and services, and changes in consumer preferences that have not only broken that compact but also created other incentives to ensure affordable service. As the Commission undertakes this proceeding, it has expressed a particular interest in some of the challenges that affect the affordability of communication services as a whole and for COLA services specifically, as well as the existing trends in the telecom marketplace. Right off the top, I just want to say that the actual cost to provide POTS or basic service has gone up. This is because the cost to maintain that 150-year-old network is only increasing year after year due to a lack of available equipment and the fact that these networks are energy hogs. One of our member companies estimates that its barely used copper network accounts for 36% of its entire carbon footprint. I think it's also important to, we're talking about the distinction of copper networks versus other advanced networks, but in California, California is the leader in copper theft and vandalism. It is a nationwide network problem, and it only increases the cost of maintaining these networks. They are stolen. It happens here in LA all the time. They are clipped. To repair them, it takes hundreds of hours of technician work that could actually be used in helping to improve other aspects of the network. So the rising cost to provide POTS, coupled with the fact that the subscribership for these services is declining precipitously year after year, means that the cost of legacy POTS service will not only increase in the coming years, it is an inevitable fact. However, the good news, we need to acknowledge that broadband prices have declined significantly over the last 10 years. U.S. Telecom's own broadband pricing index shows that. In the BPI, we look at these costs of telecom services across the industry and compare them to other household essentials, tracking pricing trends for service offerings between 100 megabits and 1 gig. Year after year, we find that the cost of these services drop for consumers at a level beyond the more than 32% inflation that consumers have experienced since 2015. In fact, since 2015, prices for the most popular speed tiers have dropped 9.4% year over year, equating to a total of a 60% drop since then. Further fueling consumer purchasing power as prices decline, upload and download speeds for broadband have dramatically accelerated. Since 2015, download speeds for the most popular consumer broadband services has increased by 113.5%, while upload speeds have increased by 88.5%. This combination of lower prices and faster speeds delivered an 82.1 reduction in the cost per megabit of broadband connectivity from down from 87 cents to 16 cents over the past 9 years. This is important because most consumers have moved away from basic telephone service and moved to broadband, and they are doing so because they are getting better prices and more service. According to the state's largest copper landline provider, which is AT&T, the price of traditional copper phone service on average is about $42 per month in California, whereas modern internet and wireless services range from $30 to $45 per month, offering greater affordability while also providing more robust service with features like texting, video calls, and high-speed internet access. Furthermore, nearly all providers have low-cost plans designed specifically for families of all types. U.S. Telecom's members were very supportive of the Affordable Connectivity Plan, and although we're all disappointed it was not renewed, our members have continued to offer those low-cost options. Furthermore, the simple fact that there is so much competition in the marketplace has lowered costs. That's how it works. In addition, California's own data shows that the CHCFB fund, the B fund, which was designed to achieve affordable service in high-cost areas, has gone from $400 million to about a $20 million program. It's important to note that that $400 million figure is in 1996 dollars, which would make it a lot higher today. But even more important is the fact that it's just simply there's not as many consumers that are supporting that fund. The numbers declined from about 4 million consumer lines to approximately 40,000. This is all because there's better alternatives available, which consumers are getting via wireless and Lifeline. Basic service is a creation of the CPUC and not necessary any longer because the CPUC made it possible for wireless and VoIP providers to also provide Lifeline. In essence, creating its own definition of basic service for wireless and VoIP services, the services that customers overwhelmingly choose. In short, there's no need to maintain COLR obligations or the basic service definition simply in the name of affordability. Consumers have already answered how. Californians have long had a choice of providers in the majority of California. In fact, based on 2020 census data, which is conservative considering we're now in 2025, over 75% or 3/4 of the homes are served by 3 or more such providers. This fixed broadband availability numbers don't even encompass satellite broadband, of which there are 3 in California that provide service to 100% of California homes. Californians also have access to robust mobile and fixed wireless broadband. 99.4% of California homes are served by 3 or more mobile wireless broadband providers in addition to fixed broadband and satellite, all of which are capable of providing voice service, by the way, of facilities-based standalone service and over-the-top services. Not to mention the many providers who also provide legacy telephone service, and they have overwhelmingly left that basic service behind and migrated to wireless and VoIP. Therefore, the removal of COLR obligations will not reduce the affordability of communication services. Indeed, it would likely improve it. U.S. Telecom's members agree with this commission that the transition to modern networks must not be a financial burden to consumers, but coupled with that, we must also avoid chaining consumers to a service that will become increasingly obsolete and more expensive in the years to come.
Hi, I'm Itzel Hayward with Small Business Utility Advocates, or SBUA. SBUA's constituents are made up of the over 4.1 million small businesses in California that play a critical role in California's economy, providing jobs and serving their communities. Individually, they're small, but collectively, they make up 99.8% of California businesses and employ nearly half, or 47.9%, of the private workforce in California. Although one of the handouts I received related to participation in this panel refers to residential telephone customers, our constituents are happy to know that Commission rules require COLRs to offer basic service to any customer within its designated COLR territory, including small business customers. Small businesses play an important role in furthering the goals that the Commission adopted in its Environmental and Social Justice Action Plan, or ESJ Action Plan. These goals explicitly include expanding non-residential equity, as well as seeking to expand services and inclusion in Commission decision-making to ESJ communities, or unserved and underserved communities. And I really appreciated the distinction the moderator made between low-income communities and households and program qualifying households, because this is really what the ESJ Action Plan is all about. It's looking to protect Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, non-English speaking communities, hard-to-reach consumers, including customers in hard-to-reach rural areas, customers in disadvantaged communities, and more. So rather than respond directly to each of the questions we received, SBUA would like to take the opportunity offered to them to structure this presentation in a way that addresses the broader topics reflected in those questions. So affordability is an acute concern for many small businesses. Many are operating on very thin margins, and the cost of communication services can consume a larger portion of their budget as compared to medium and larger sized businesses. So not having reliable, affordable communication options could significantly impact their financial stability or even their survival, which makes Kohler providers so important to SBUA and its constituents. When it comes to affordability, existing trends demonstrate that market competition is not enough to ensure affordable, reliable communication services. For example, we know from studies, such as the one cited to in SBUA's response to the OIR in this proceeding, that there have been instances of ISPs in so-called well-served areas, specifically in this case Los Angeles County, where we're located today, targeting upgrades such that they avoided upgrading areas made up primarily of low-income communities and Black communities. And we know from the network exam that my co-panelist referred to that AT&T and Frontier have demonstrated a persistent pattern of focusing on service quality and increased investments in higher income and predominantly white communities while overlooking lower communities and communities of color. These are the communities that have been left behind. This is redlining, which does in fact still happen, including in so-called well-served areas. Redlining is still a very real experience faced by many ESJ communities. Patterns and trends like these highlight that market competition is not the end-all be-all. These patterns and trends are why relying on market competition alone is more likely to perpetuate and even worsen existing disparities in service access. And they highlight the importance of continued and careful commission oversight, in this case, of course, the Kohler obligations, to ensure access and affordability. This is an issue of equity for residential consumers and an issue for small business consumers of non-residential equity, as raised in the ESJ Action Plan. Furthermore, leaving those small businesses that are located within ESJ communities themselves would be particularly detrimental to ESJ communities, where small businesses play a uniquely important role in stimulating economic growth and job creation and providing opportunities for Californians to build thriving communities. When it comes to determining affordability, the Commission currently assesses affordability through metrics like considering the number of minimum wage hours a consumer needs to work to pay for essential services, or the affordability ratio, which calculates the portion of income a household would spend on utility services after accounting for essential living expenses. Now, to address non-residential equity and ensure that reliable communication services are affordable to small businesses, SBUA recommends that the Commission explore the possibility of creating an affordability metric that applies to small businesses. For example, a hypothetical affordability ratio for small businesses could factor in the percentage of operational net income spent on communication services after accounting for variable costs and fixed costs like rent and payroll and utilities. In other words, the Commission could develop a metric that addresses the financial pressures small businesses face and assess their capacity to afford essential communication services. And SBUA is ready to collaborate closely with the Commission throughout this proceeding to refine and implement such a measure as it relates to affordable Kohler services for small businesses. SBUA also wishes to acknowledge the Commission for including the issue of adopting broadband as a basic service as a topic for the next panel. Having both and unbundled voice and broadband services available supports economic and social development as well as communication resiliency for both residential and small business customers, particularly important during natural disasters and other emergencies, as we've heard about today. And more small businesses are increasingly relying on broadband in their operations. And Redline is not just about availability, it's also about affordability. As we've already touched on, even in so-called well-served areas, broadband, including actual, not marketed speed, reliability, and quality, is not equitably available to all customers. But even if it were, availability is not the same as affordability. For example, the fact that broadband adoption rates remain disproportionately low in underserved communities, even where broadband is available, raises the issue of affordability and is something that we need to take a closer look at. So for this reason, broadband is not an adequate substitute or proxy for Kohler obligations, but SBUA would support integrating broadband into the Kohler basic service definition, not only to ensure its availability, but also its affordability for all Californians. This would go a long way toward bridging the digital divide and promoting equitable access to essential communications services. That said, this is a bigger issue that SBUA is willing to revisit in written comments submitted after the workshops in a more complete and considered way, should the Commission request it. We're more than willing to do that. And finally, SBUA applauds the Commission for taking a closer look at the impacts of when and how carriers are allowed to withdraw as COLRs. We support the withdrawal of COLRs where appropriate. However, setting conditions for the withdrawal of COLR obligations is a critical piece of maintaining affordable communication services, especially in underserved communities where consumers are most vulnerable to market fluctuations and service reductions. With regard to the appropriate requirements carriers must meet before the Commission will authorize a withdrawal from their COLR obligations, SBUA supports the arguments raised by the other consumer groups today, including C4AT, TURN, and RCRC's point that areas that have no demand will never have demand. We don't believe that's a point that can be assumed to be correct. And we would only add the following two conditions, and maybe more upon further reflection. But first, to protect California's most underserved consumers and to fulfill the residential and non-residential equity goals of the ESG Action Plan, the Commission should hold a COLR to a higher standard if the territory from which the COLR is seeking to withdraw contains areas with high concentrations of small businesses or of any ESJ or historically underserved communities. And so that would be the proportion of folks there. So even if there aren't a lot of folks there, something that we would definitely want the Commission to consider and look at. And this could be done through some combination of, we heard about ground truthing, self-reporting. Also public hearings can be really, really effective to hear what's actually happening in these communities, and SBUA would support that. And second, a COLR seeking to withdraw should be required to notify all ratepayers in the COLR territory of its request to withdraw, not just residential ratepayers, as stated in the OIR. And before closing, SBUA would just like to state again its support for C4AT's proposals for increasing affordability and considerations, and interrupting the cycle of disinvestment in ESJ communities. And help to further residential and non-residential equity by ensuring that all communities, regardless of their economic status or geographic location, have continuous and affordable access to basic and emergency communication services. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right, here we go. First and foremost, my name is Janus Norman, president of the California Broadband and Video Association. We represent the cable ISP providers within the state of California. That, to differentiate myself from U.S. Telecom, that do not currently have COLR obligations upon its membership. First and foremost, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this workshop. I want to provide some sort of overarching comments and then address some of the questions asked by your staff. Specifically, let me affirmatively state that we share the Commission's goal of ensuring all Californians have access to essential voice services. Consistent with that goal, Cal Broadband believes the PUC's COLR withdrawal decision-making should be based on the existence of competition for voice services. Competition is key, in our opinion, to affordability, specific to the question before this panel. Competition means that consumers have the ability to choose between voice services across multiple technologies that best meets their needs, and that competition is operating in a way that disciplines rates and ensure rates remain affordable. Cal Broadband supports maintaining COLR obligation where there is a lack of competition for voice services, and supports not having COLRs in areas in which sufficient competition for voice services are options to customers. Specifically, we believe the Commission should leave existing COLRs where, again, consumers lack competitive alternatives. As a reminder, those COLRs were set up as subsidized markets through decades of investment through the universal service funding. And then second, determining which areas do not need a COLR because there is competitive access to voice services. Again, where there is a designation that adequate competition exists, we believe that there should not be any provider that is designated as a COLR. The COLA rules were adopted to ensure Californians had at least one voice service provider. Today, nearly all Californians have a voice service due to expansion of networks and competition. There is multimodal competition, which means customers have access to services provided over multiple technologies, including mobile wireless, fixed wireless, emergent satellite services, VoIP services, over-the-top voice services, and those options continue to grow and provide for the needs of customers. Imposing COLR duties on competitive providers would distort competition, discourage investment, and create legal and policy challenges, particularly as it is applied to VoIP providers. If the commission finds that a COLR is necessary in a particular area, then it should not make changes in those areas. In other words, it should not allow the COLR to withdraw. Many states have moved in a direction of adopting frameworks that provide a pathway that reduces and eventually eliminates COLR obligations without any adverse impacts to consumer impacts. As discussed in your April 4th workshop, the commissioner from Nevada talked about how Nevada did not require a replacement COLR, and that did not cause any issues as it relates to affordability. Now turning to some of the specific questions, excuse me. For some reason my voice is cracking. Question was, what are some of the existing challenges that affect the affordability of communication services as a whole and for COLR services specifically? Our response would be COLR is one component of universal service, which is intended to ensure that all Californians have access to voice services. Affordability is another component of universal service that the commission has been directed to address in specific ways. For example, the MORE Act with regards to lifeline services in part talks about the need to address affordable rates through that program. As such, Cal Broadband actually agrees with the scoping memo, which did not include affordability for consideration in phase one. To the extent that affordability is commented on in this proceeding, we are unaware in the Cal Broadband space where affordability issues have been raised as relates to voice issues, especially with the existence of the Lifeline program. In any event, we believe that competition remains the best driver for affordability, and competition is at the center of Cal Broadband's proposal. Again, COLR withdrawal consistent with our proposal would not create affordability concerns because it would only happen where there is competition. What data or parameters should the commission consider when determining affordability for communication services? Again, when we talk about communication services for the purposes of COLR, we think it's important to remain focused on voice services. I know there have been many comments about broadband, but COLR is specifically a voice service issue. Broadband availability is front and center in various other grant programs such as IGA, FFA, BEAD. Those programs all include specific low cost and low income requirements for those grant recipients. That said, as we previously noted, again, our proposal relates on the existence of real competition, and where real competition exists for voice services, affordability should not be an issue. And then lastly, what trends should the commission monitor in considering the future of affordability of communication services? Again, we would just reiterate that our proposal centers on voice competition, and where we accurately identify that competition exists, you will not have an issue with removing the COLR obligation with regards to affordability. Thank you.
this one working?
Oh, I got it back. Thanks. Thank you, everyone. So my first question actually is for Itzel regarding small businesses. What is your or your organization's view with regard to, I'm sorry, I'm going to bring up the issue of telephone service, typically tied to copper, but specifically point of sale applications for your businesses or alarms, or do you have any sense of that dependence?
Yes, yes, our constituency absolutely uses landline, copper-based telephone service, and in fact, small businesses are slower to let go of that than larger businesses, so we do have an interest in maintaining that and making sure that they have those services available to them.
Do you have cases where businesses are able to upgrade to an internet protocol based, an IP, internet-based point of sale or alarm, so that it's not really an issue anymore, or what's your sense of that?
That has happened in some cases, but for a lot of small businesses, they simply maintain their landline services and do business that way. But there's definitely been transition, yeah, for many of our constituents.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question to Rachel regarding, you mentioned accessibility, and this is particularly of interest to me because I oversee the Deaf and Disabled Telecommunications Program, which is now called California Connect, and I've been aware of the issue of affordability, and I know within Lifeline, people who qualify under DDTP can get 2 Lifeline benefits. Can you say anything more about that with regard to Kohler service?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part?
Yeah, just if you, in terms of affordability, you mentioned earlier about people with disabilities tending to have a higher incidence of being in low-income brackets. And currently, Lifeline, you are able to qualify for 2 Lifeline benefits. If you qualify for the Deaf and Disabled program, you can get 2. So I was curious if you have any sort of feedback or input on that.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that, that's customers with disabilities still experience challenges, and with transitioning to different technologies, and I can add more to that, follow up with a better answer in written comments.
Certainly.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. So moving over to Lynn, thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned earlier about the cost of providing POTS service, and I've heard anecdotes about how carriers are having to go to eBay to buy equipment to do repairs on switches, and obviously there's also this issue about carbon footprint. Do you have any sense of, in terms of cost of operations, how much is saved by moving to IP-based networks?
I'll have to look and see what some actual numbers are for you, but it is a combination of repair time, like actually cost of getting the necessary equipment, which, as you said, yes, providers are actually going on eBay to find this stuff. The price of copper is very high, which is part of the reason so many people are stealing it. So there's the theft problem, there's the tech time to repair, there's the cost of the actual materials. And when I say, time to repair, if you think about a massive, like, these are huge cables, right? And there's 600 strands of, copper that has to be literally manually spliced together. And if it gets wet because it happens during a storm or whether it's cut, it has to literally lay out and dry. Fiber can be repaired like that. So this is part of the reason why there's this disincentive to keep repairing it and why the costs just keep going up exponentially.
Thank you. And moving over to Janus. So obviously already there are low-income programs in place for, I think, all the cable operators in California, all the major cable operators, right? So you've got Internet Essentials with Comcast, and other providers have their own versions. As I was talking earlier about, there's still this gap between income qualified versus Californians who don't qualify for these programs but are still essentially having affordability issues. And I know that, you know, we've all been in discussions about how to try to solve that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well,
So just to add more,
yeah.
above the income qualified programs, you
Yes.
still have people who are struggling to pay bills.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one, in context, right? It would be, I think we all have to acknowledge in the context of individuals, let's just say just over the threshold of the whatever federal poverty level you want to designate, right? If you think about most service programs, you're either talking about 200% of the poverty line for qualifications or about 130%. When you sort of think about California's from housing assistance to healthcare, things of that nature. You get over that line, households are making choices. I think the difficulty of that, if you're trying to tackle that from a global perspective, is it's hard for the commission to value how an individual household is valuing the existence of a certain type of cable certain type of communications package versus how much more money they want to spend on some other essential item, right? So does a family make it that qualifies for housing assistance, also qualifies for Lifeline, qualifies for internet essentials? Do they choose to live in a slightly bigger apartment versus, right, buy extra groceries, right? So I think in the context of that, there's always a challenge. When you sort of look at the pricing structures within the communication space, the vast majority of ISP providers are all competing based on price and service. So you see whether you're looking at your mobile providers, your fixed wireless providers, your cable broadband providers, they're all competing to essentially create the maximum amount of value consistent with their business model, limitations of their infrastructure. And so from that standpoint, competition is working at the macro level to continuously push prices down. So that is why, and while it's in the context of broadband, you know, there's always been references to our prices for communication services at or below inflationary prices. And consistently, they're below inflationary prices. That means that competition's working at the macro level. Does that mean that competition solves for every individual household situation? Absolutely not, and it would be disingenuous to say so. But I don't think from a policy perspective we can solve for the individual household situation. We have to solve for the sort of larger macro analysis, because typically from a government standpoint, the way you provide assistance to whom you deem eligible is to provide some level of subsidy. And the provision of subsidies always has a sustainability problem, right? Whether it's, again, across different disciplines, you are always subject to the volatility of resources available to the state government or federal government. And so that's why our organization points back to, for once you get past sort of income eligible programs, not discouraging competition, looking at how you have policy structures that incentivize competition, including, quite frankly, the ability to have new entrants into the market and what that will do. Because from a macro perspective, it is the most sustainable way to push down, keep down prices for that population of individuals that are not income eligible.
Could I follow on for just 1 second to add a little piece of color to that? Just, I think part of what Janice is talking about is choice, right? Consumers in their own homes make choices. And we just saw statistically with the ACP, you know, long live the ACP, we wish it would come back. But when consumers they had to choose, right? You get it on one product. And overwhelmingly, they chose wireless. That just seems to be the way that the market's moving, and that's partly because that's the kind of service that folks like. And it just shows that you can't account really necessarily for, we would love for everybody to take a fiber product in their home or landline, but sometimes they just choose not to.
Can I just make one other point too? Sorry. And you're starting to see different service offerings, right? So I like to sometimes point to pop culture, right? So you got Ryan Reynolds out there saying, mobile's this awesome thing, right? You also have, quote unquote, traditional companies sort of following in those footsteps and offering those types of products, right? All-in products, low-cost products, where there's a set price, where the consumer essentially can purchase in advance the service, knows exactly what they're paying. That is another illustration of how competition works, right? So whether it's, Comcast is now Charter, both Charter and Cox have their own products, and the names are escaping me, so forgive me, my members that are in the audience. But you see sort of that model of competition working, right? As you have entrants come into the marketplace that all of a sudden create competition, even amongst different social demographics, you see the mainstay competitors, right? The traditional incumbent providers react to that marketplace in order to maintain customer retention.
I'd like to ask a question, I think primarily for C4AT, but I welcome views from others as well. I recognize that we as a commission have acknowledged that affordability can be a barrier to accessing communications services for Californians. And I think traditionally we've thought of Lifeline as the primary venue where we are engaged in a state regulatory action to reduce that barrier. And what I want to make sure that I really understand is, in light of some of the low-cost offerings that some carriers are offering, in light of the Lifeline program, what is kind of the reason for adding an affordability metric within COLR that gets to something that Lifeline and those other offerings don't get to at this stage?
I think that, I recognize the availability of those things and making communication services more affordable. I think consumers have found that the low-cost offerings from providers are not enough, and with the high cost of living and other expenses that consumers have to account for, there are a lot of challenges for people who are not quite eligible for Lifeline, or hard to reach, have difficulty getting information about programs. So I think those are some barriers, and high cost of living, having a lot of challenges with meeting customers who don't necessarily qualify for programs but are still experiencing these barriers. Thanks.
If I may add, thank you. Yes, a lot of our constituents fall into that gap, right, where they don't qualify for Lifeline, but they're still low income and really struggling to afford communication services. And to your point, Commissioner, you'd mentioned, what happens when these companies go away. What does happen when these companies? It is a problem, and when they go away, they often also take away that competition that's being discussed on a macro level as a great force. I do agree. On a macro level, it is really powerful, but doesn't solve the issues for all of our constituents.
I would just add that I just think we got to remember that sometimes cost alone is not the only reason that there's a lack of adoption, right? I think there are great efforts that have been made and will continue to be made both by governments and private industry on digital literacy and making folks aware of the programs that are available. I will say California has one of the most generous Lifeline programs in the state, and I think it's important, these are the kinds of things that need to be disseminated because sometimes people just don't know that it's available to them.
I appreciate all those responses. I have a separate question that I think is probably best for U.S. Telecom, although I welcome other views again. This morning we heard from rural-focused advocates that one area of affordability concern is really the way that development happens in rural communities, and having potentially a single unit developed that may not be closely connected to existing infrastructure, and competitive providers potentially not being present or not being willing to extend their service at a price that is manageable by someone who's building a house in a rural area. And I wonder if you could speak to, I guess one more preface, industry here has acknowledged, I think, that there are a set of customers who are in a much more difficult place with respect to COLA obligations, and there are some real challenges to solve here. And I wonder if you could speak to how we should consider affordability in this kind of service extension circumstance, dealing with that single rural customer building a new building that's not closely connected to a larger community or neighborhood, and may ultimately be an unprofitable customer, and the affordability of getting communications service in one form or another to that customer.
So I think it's important to remember that I think what's being proposed by industry here is optional, right? A COLR can ask to withdraw, and it would potentially follow a transition to do that. There are rural small providers, some of whom are U.S. Telecom members, that are in very rural areas that are looking to use BEAD, and they're using FFA funds to extend their networks, and they're happy to maintain their COLR obligation because they are subsidized. So I think, it's important to remember that there was a implicit subsidy when the COLR rules were adopted, and now that doesn't exist for the largest COLR, those under the COLR obligations currently. But the small ones who are in rural areas, they're getting explicit subsidies, and that's why they're happy to maintain that. So I think that's one piece of it, is that there are rural providers still out there serving rural America. There are mobile services out there as well. There are satellite services that are ubiquitously covering more and more. So I think all of these things show you that the way is competition ultimately. Also, we have to remember that we're still haven't quite gotten off the ground, but it's getting closer, hopefully by the day, the BEAD program, where California has said, look at all these areas that don't have service, we're gonna spend this money there. We're gonna focus on those unserved communities, which is a great thing. And so hopefully there will be competition in those areas, and I think that's one of the ways that we combat it.
I think also, too, some of the program design, and I could have this slightly wrong, so I'm slightly afraid of what I'm going to say. But if I understood your scenario correctly, that should be a individual house that should be able to apply for the line extension program, right? But the line extension program has its own set of income and eligibilities to it. And so part of the look at affordability might be not necessarily to look at a specific income level, but look at the, for lack of a better term, geographic area in which the individual is applying for that line extension. It doesn't make sense in the context of that versus sort of a hard line income level. So some of it may just be we've got to re-look at some of the programs and the rules around some of those existing programs as well for the micro level solutions.
So I think yeah, good, it's on. So I want to continue a little bit with the macro and micro discussion, but of course I'm going to focus on the micro.
Sounds good.
I think the question is for all the panelists, but I do want to start with you, Mr. Norman, because you're the one who has discussed some of this, and your association has talked about voice alternatives, and of course those voice alternatives are VoIP and wireless.
Essentially, yep.
And so in your analysis of what is an effective, or maybe not effective, what is an alternate provider, what is a successful competitor, did you do a more detailed look considering some of the faults in the wireless mapping that you've heard about today? Have you also considered other micro cases, like, for example, many elevators need a copper wire to them. Otherwise, in an emergency, that could be a problem. And, there could be a lot of the folks who use devices subsidized or provided by DDDP program, those only are compatible with pods. And so these are kind of important micro circumstances that we probably need to consider as part of our COLR application, both keeping them affordable, but just considering them as part of the COLR withdrawal process. So I'm wondering, were you thinking about those specific micros when you put together your analysis? And if not, how would that affect your analysis? Or how should we, the commission, go about kind of considering those specific micro areas or topics?
Yeah. So our analysis was mostly in the voice space. So we weren't thinking about, I'm going to pick on your elevator example. So we did not, because for our analysis, that wasn't necessarily the consideration. We would think, though, in your evaluation of what the process should be, there would be sort of a spelled out process, the ability for additional conversations and workshops to further discuss those. So I don't have the granularity that you're looking for at this moment, but I think from our perspective, one, there's sort of is there an acceptance of the premise, and then how do we move once there's an acceptance of the premise? So we're happy to participate in discussions, but we will now figure out about elevators.
And alarms.
And alarms, got it.
I just reiterate the importance of considering customers whose devices are not compatible or not completely compatible with VoIP and wireless, and also with just considering the importance of communication in general. Customers with disabilities, because of their extreme vulnerability during power shutoffs and disasters, it just underscores the importance of them having effective communication options, especially for individuals whose options are limited.
And do you have thoughts on how we can actually do that from a process standpoint?
Yeah, I think I agree with the point in the opening remarks about the need for more customer-centric data on that. And in thinking about metrics, we've been thinking about surveys and such as that, but that is another thing I can follow up with on written comments. Thank you.
I know there's been some controversy about how good or bad the maps are, in the first panel, and I understand there's obviously nothing's ever perfect, but I just would point out that map has been exposed to an ongoing challenge process at the FCC, where anybody in this room or anybody in the state can 24/7, 365 days a year challenge what's going on at their home address. And the CPUC itself took that map, did a secondary challenge process for purposes of BEAD. So I think, although it may not be perfect, we're getting to a pretty granular level about the type of service that's out there and what the alternatives are.
And I would just like to say I appreciate the question, ALJ Glagola, because it is in the micro, right? That is where we lose underserved and unserved communities, right? It's in the, when we look at the big picture, sure, 95% of Californians or 99% of Californians or 99.9% of Californians fill in the blank. But it's those remaining 1%, those are the ones that are underserved and that need the protection of the commission.
There we go. I have a follow-up question for U.S. Telecom, and this is regarding rural telephone service. So I understood from AT&T's presentation this morning the idea that there were 3 buckets or 3 areas. The third area being where service is still, Kohler service is still justified because there's no other offer, other service available. And currently we have the High Cost Fund B to support rural telephone service, to keep service affordable. What are your thoughts on maintaining or even expanding that program to continue to support rural service and keep it affordable?
I think there's always going to be challenges in those high cost to serve areas. U.S. Telecom's, the bulk of U.S. Telecom's membership, if you go on a company by company basis, is rural telephone, small rural, former LECs are LECs. And they participate and rely a lot on programs like Reconnect at USDA and USF primarily, but also the B Fund here in California. And I think those programs should be maintained and potentially expanded. I know U.S. Telecom as an association has been looking to the FCC and Congress to expand the contribution base to the Universal Service Fund, in part to potentially re-up the ACP, but mostly because there is a need, and there's going to be a need when BEAD gets finished, because these are the most hardest to serve, highest cost areas, and that ongoing OpEx, which is part of what USF provides, it's not just a CapEx fund, it's an OpEx fund, and that is absolutely essential to keep these networks up and running over the long term.
So just a follow-up question to that. If the commission were to expand the High Cost Fund B to support broadband for those areas, would U.S. Telecom be supportive of that to provide broadband in addition as part of Kohler for those remaining areas where there is no other option?
Well, like I said, I think that the Kohler relief is what's being proposed is optional, right? And I think your small rural LECs that are out in some of those areas would be quite happy if you did that. That would help them out a lot.
Hello, there we go. I want to thank all of you for your time today and for your thoughts, and this has been a very helpful and instructive panel. Thank you so much. And we're going to break now, and we reconvene at 2:20. All right? Thank you, everyone.
Third panel. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. On to our final panel for the day. I want to thank both of you for joining us, and I'll ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon. I'm Allison Ellis, SVP of Business Development, Grant and Government Affairs for Frontier Communications.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ernesto Falcone. I'm the Program Manager for Cal Advocates, the Communications and Broadband Policy Branch.
Thank you both. And we've posed a number of questions for you each to cover in a presentation. I'm not sure if you have an order decided between you, but I will leave it to you to decide who goes first.
Thank you. I guess I'll go first. So I don't have a slides, but I guess I'd like to start with a short history of the industry and Kohler because I think it provides an important context for the discussion of how Kohler should be adapted to the present. When Kohler was first established in the 90s, ILECs were monopoly providers with a defined service territory and a guaranteed rate of return, meaning when ILECs invested to expand their networks, they were assured that they'd recoup that investment. And when they invested to reach high-cost locations, we, through sanctioned CPUC rates, got a return on that investment. And there was a whole system of implicit and explicit subsidies, including the Federal Universal Service Fund, that enabled companies to serve the most difficult, most uneconomic locations and areas not at a loss. That system is gone. Today, the telecommunications industry is one of the most competitive industries in California and the nation. ILECs are no longer the sole provider of voice or internet services, and ILECs no longer have the market dominance that they once did in their service territories. In fact, as we've heard earlier, ILECs have the fewest voice customers. Voice and broadband services are available to greater than 95% of locations through an overlapping constellation of competitors that includes ILECs, CLECs, cable companies, fixed and mobile wireless providers, and it's essentially 100% if you include satellite providers. And when these companies, when Frontier invests to serve a location, there's no guarantee that we'll earn a return on our investment. Our rates are not regulated, and we must rely on the fiscal responsibility of our company and our own competitive prowess to succeed. For those locations where private investment has not reached, we're in the midst of a historic period of state and national investment in improved connectivity. There have been literally billions of dollars through programs like CASF, RDOF, and the FFA available to subsidize the build-out of connectivity to very remote, very high-cost, uneconomic areas. California, as one of the panelists noted, is in the midst of its BEAD award process where there's $1.8 billion to ensure that 100% of the state is covered with broadband services. Under BEAD, there are 372,000 unserved and underserved locations left in the state. So if you think about that, that's really amazing. When you look at the BDC data, the most recent data says there are 16.2 million residential and small business serviceable locations in California. That includes MDU units. And all but 372,000 of them have access to broadband of at least 100/20. I might add that, I know that there's some discrepancy or mistrust of the BDC data. That data has been subject to multiple years of refinement. In California, it has been subject to a challenge process. Arguably, it overrepresents the unserved and underserved locations because that challenge process was conducted in 2024, and carriers could not really challenge locations based on their planned service. So expansion has continued throughout 2024 and into 2025, so more of those locations are served. At the conclusion of BEAD, then, there's really a very strong argument that there's no longer a need for Kohler because all of the locations will be served with connectivity that's readily able to support voice. And if Kohler remains, it really needs to change. Applying the obligation to a handful of legacy ILECs seems the wrong approach, particularly when competitors to the ILECs will have received public funding to build out locations, to overbuild ILEC territories, and therefore they will be the ones who are best positioned to earn the necessary return on the investment to sustain service over the long term. I just need to confess, a little bit confused by the questions because as I understood the scoping ruling, the question was not whether the definition of broadband or definition of basic service should be expanded to include broadband, but whether it was reasonable to consider the availability of VoIP services that are delivered over a broadband connection, or I should say internet connection, in the context of carriers seeking withdrawal. So I'll do my best to answer the questions, and I'll take them in order. So the first is, should the commission update the definition of basic service to include broadband internet? I would argue no, that a change to the basic service definition to include broadband is not necessary. I talked about the history up front of the Kohler obligation, providing the regulatory context for Kohler. I think it's also critical to look at consumer behavior, which has dramatically changed over time. The vast majority of California consumers are not purchasing POTS or other voice services from ILECs. Consumers have made it clear that they view other technologies as adequate alternatives to POTS. The FCC's Voice Services Report data shows that as of December 2023, there were 48 million mobile connections in the state of California, 7.5 million VoIP subscriptions, and just over 2.2 million switched connections or commission-regulated connections, so across the entire state. That means that as of 2023, only 3.5% of all voice connections in the state were regulated, and that number is certainly lower today. So the Kohler obligations should reflect the dramatic change in market structure, the change in technology, and importantly, the change in consumer behavior. In terms of what challenges, if any, would this present for Kohlers if the commission were to include broadband internet as a basic service? So first, I would say that broadband, as it's commonly understood, is not necessary for voice over IP services. What is necessary is an internet connection. According to the most widely used ITU voice over IP codec standard, the service requires a 64 kilobit per second symmetrical connection. No one would call that broadband. It's a very modest, basic level of internet connectivity. Establishing broadband as a basic service, which again I believe is outside of the scope of this proceeding, would create significant challenges for providers and ultimately consumers. The principal challenges are being the cost of the necessary expansion of infrastructure and the cost of voice service. So we all know that deployment of facilities is a hugely expensive undertaking, which providers are largely independently funding to date. When investing private capital, all companies have investment criteria and fiduciary obligations that they must meet before expending that capital to ensure that the expansion and delivery of service is sustainable over the long term. The industry has invested $18.8 billion in the last 5 years in California. For its part, Frontier has invested $2.2 billion in California since 2021, and our investment is continuing. This has all been privately funded, so meaning at-risk investment where we are not guaranteed a rate of return that is sanctioned by the CPUC or anyone else. It is well understood that private companies cannot solely sustain the cost of expanding service to high-cost locations and that they need substantial help to do so. That's the reason why programs like CISF, FFA, RDOF, and of course the BEAD program exist. As I said, there's those programs. There's also the $3 billion in tribal funding that was available. $167 million of that was awarded to tribes in the state of California. This funding is all an express recognition that private capital is insufficient to expand infrastructure into high-cost areas and sustain service, including connectivity that's sufficient to provide voice applications or support voice applications. When providers are compelled to serve high-cost areas that are uneconomic, they're compelled to assess the true cost of that service on customers, which prices most customers out of the service, and it's a vicious cycle, making the investment all the more untenable. Whether to include broadband internet as part of a basic service, how would that affect consumers? I'm not sure it would have any effect. And that's because, as the FCC data shows, consumers aren't using POTS. They are, purchasing their voice services through other methods, and POTS lines continue to decline year over year. Throughout Frontier's footprint, as in other ILEC service territories, our consumers are selecting other technologies for their voice communications. Under BEAD, because the state's obligation is to award funding in a manner that ensures that 100% of the unserved and underserved locations are connected with at least 100 over 20 megabits per second, all of those locations will have far more than sufficient internet service, broadband service to meet the basic symmetrical 64 kilobit per second needs for voice over IP. I would also add that although Lifeline support and discounts is helpful, if companies were to assess the true cost on customers, it wouldn't go far enough to make the service affordable for customers. What new costs would including broadband internet as a basic service create for carriers of last resort, and how could the Commission mitigate these costs? I'm not sure that the Commission could effectively mitigate the costs of them. As I stated before, it's extremely expensive to expand infrastructure into high-cost, uneconomic areas, and even a return to rate of return regulation would not mitigate the impact because the cost of the expansion is just too great. In addition, I'd be remiss if I didn't say it's unclear to me why the focus remains on the legacy providers, many of whom, like Frontier, are not the dominant provider within their service territory anymore. We don't enjoy a monopoly structure as we did when Kohler was first instituted, and we are competing against a whole constellation of very tenacious competitors that are often much better funded than we are. And then the last question, how should broadband internet be defined if we were to include the definition of basic service? Again, it's our position at Frontier that the expansion of the basic service definition to include broadband is beyond the scope of this proceeding. And in any event, as I explained, the internet connection that's needed to support voice over IP is not a broadband connection, but rather a very modest base level of internet connectivity. And just to reiterate, when you are looking at how consumers are behaving, consumers are not choosing POTS. They are choosing alternative technologies that are clearly widely available because there's 48 million wireless subscriptions across the state of California. And they have already determined that that's an adequate voice alternative to POTS service. You see that in the exodus of POTS customers. And I'll stop there.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm here to discuss the importance of bringing broadband into basic service as part of a transition tool from moving away from carrier of last resort to a modernized rural structure. My comments reflect the submission by Cal Advocates and why we've suggested this pathway towards the future. My presentation will focus on the need for updating basic service for Kohlers, specifically for Kohlers seeking to withdraw from their core obligation to maintain our commitment to universal access to reliable, high quality, and affordable communication services. Cal Advocates submitted its proposal on Kohler as a forward-looking, regulated transition into the 21st century. The PUC has long committed to the belief that all Californians have access to essential communication services. And the Commission has defined basic services as those services essential to meet universal service needs. Historically, this has meant providing basic telephone service at affordable rates. However, as technology has advanced, we should embrace modernizing the rules along with the infrastructure. That means the definition of basic service must evolve to reflect modern basic needs. In today's digital age, broadband is the essential ingredient for all communications and participation in the modern society. It is crucial for education, employment, healthcare, and public safety. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the importance of having a reliable home internet connection for both remote learning and remote work. And broadband access also improves health outcomes by enabling telehealth services by providing access to vital, and also provides access to vital public safety information. But despite the progress made in expanding access, many Californians still lack universal access to high-speed internet. Kohlers have represented that the historical obligation that they're operating under undermines their ability to deploy more broadband. If we take that at face value, then a revision of the Kohler rules should expand broadband. The problem is carriers are private entities with private motives, and what they have told investors, particularly AT&T's CEO, has stated explicitly a desire to pull back the network from, quote, low utilization geographies and, quote, low profit geographies. In other words, rural and low income areas. So we can't operate in a vacuum here on what a Kohler that covers 75% of the state of California wishes to do if the obligation was removed without consumer protection rules to follow. However, despite the private motive, Kohler rules prevent that outcome, and that is a good thing, in keeping with nearly a century of tradition here. The telecom market throughout its entire history has always been a market created through a balance of private motives and public needs. The government has regularly called balls and strikes on what is permissible and what is off the table, and ultimately, the industry has benefited given the essential service they sell and the high demand that exists. To bridge the gap between the private sector and the public in this instance, our proposal establishes a regulated transition where all parties benefit in the long run. We believe the PUC should revise its Kohler rules to include the broadband service component as part of a regulated transition. That means updating the definition of basic service to include broadband at speeds of at least 100 down 20 up megabits per second as a precondition for Kohlers seeking to end their Kohler status. Cal Advocates also recommends adopting a sequential and structured approach for the Commission to determine if a Kohler may withdraw from its obligation under very specific conditions and identify geographies within its service area. Here are some of the fundamental steps. We should define the Kohler withdrawal request area to be no smaller than a census block group level to prevent the potential for redlining. The new basic service definition, the Kohler must achieve voice and broadband service at 100 down 20 up at 100% of the withdrawal area, and access to the service must be verified to ensure accuracy, particularly in light of the importance of maintaining 911 access. As noted in CPUC data, 1 million 911 calls happen over POTS lines, which means our risk tolerance for error here has to be as close to 0% as possible. I want to take a moment here to speak to the FCC maps in particular, since it has come up many times today. They are wholly inappropriate to use to assess critical voice service for a number of reasons. First, there is an acknowledged tolerance for error with the FCC maps because they're utilized for government funding decisions and processes that take months or sometimes years with a number of check processes along the way. If the map has it wrong, another party has several chances to respond to correct the error long before a government decision is made. A national study by the University of Chicago has found that so far the map has gotten it wrong 2.5 million times. That's 2.5 million times wrong. We have to ask ourselves, what is our tolerance for error when it comes to 911 access? Second, the FCC broadband maps show self-reported data by broadband providers on areas they can serve or also could serve in 10 days' time. Meaning it's not a map that shows who's covered, it's a map of theoretical coverage. And the FCC has never designed the map for use in this instance of what we are talking about. Other steps that a Kohler should undergo as a means of withdrawal. Service quality standards. A Kohler should be in compliance with basic service quality standards such as reliability and availability, and exiting Kohler, I mean. Exiting Kohler should not result in a loss of service. It should stand for modernization of service and a modernization of the underlying rules. A Kohler exiting should also ensure that basic services that exist, such as access to disability services, alarm systems, and other devices that are dependent on the original system are still functional after the transition. And lastly, the Kohler should continue to serve as in the Lifeline program as a non-Kohler. Universal access to broadband service will ensure that all Californians should benefit from modern communications networks. Additionally, requiring an upgrade should ensure that no customer is left behind during this technology transition. Now, a number of Kohlers will proclaim that the regulated transition is far too costly, but how they define cost is far too narrow and driven by investor expectations for fast profits, and not by the needs of communities or the California global economy. The assertion of cost ignores fundamental and critical facts as to why mandatory broadband deployment is appropriate in this context. First, a Kohler already has paying customers in these regions to finance the network. They are uniquely situated so they do not have to spend funding on advertising or any sort of customer acquisition. Second, it will make money in the long run. While investors wish for these networks to be paid off in an average of 3 to 5 years' time, the reality is 21st century communications infrastructure, which primarily runs on fiber optics, is predicted to last more than 70 years, meaning even if it took 10 years' time to recover the investment, they will still have decades of runway afterwards of growing profits. Because of the longevity of this asset, we're effectively talking about 22nd century communications infrastructure today. Lastly, Kohlers have benefited from decades of government support to build the original networks. These were not purely built by private dollars and have long ago been paid off by a combination of ratepayer money and public subsidies. The value of the copper alone is in the billions. In fact, several programs still exist now to subsidize this broadband transition, as mentioned, BEAD, FAA, and many others, and likely more in the future. In conclusion, Kohler is a reflection of our past commitment to universal access in law. It stands for the premise that everyone deserves access regardless of where they live or how much money they make. The removal of Kohler should not mean an abandonment of our values, which is why a regulated transition is necessary. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you both for those opening remarks. I have a couple of questions in mind, and I also imagine, kind of listening to you both, that there may be a little bit of dialogue that would be useful between the two of you. So I'm going to kick off with a couple of my own remarks, and then I will ask for each of you to think about what you might want to share in response to what you've heard from the other. So I will start with Frontier. I appreciate, and I think it's a tremendous success for all of us that $18 billion in private investment has gone into broadband networks in California. It is tremendous to see the volume of state and federal investment and continuing to close the gap in broadband access in the state. Wonderful to see. One challenge that I envision for the future, and I'd like to hear your response to it. You know, when we look at a program like BEAD, we are looking to develop new networks to serve specific unserved locations. We've heard about new rural development happening in the onesie-twosies over the course of today. And one challenge I envision is that even once we have BEAD networks built out, some of those onesie-twosie developments can continue to happen and will not necessarily get BEAD funding, as those developments will happen after the BEAD program funds are dispersed. How do you envision service being delivered to those subsequent households that get developed?
So the BEAD is going to fund a provider in that area to expand their network. There is, you know, the way the California program is structured, you know, there's an incentive for providers to propose higher speed networks, fiber networks, and they will serve as an important anchor for the future expansion that we know is going to occur in some areas. It's not going to occur in all rural areas just because of the nature of rural communities. You know, they often abut state parkland, national parkland, things like that. So you will have a provider who has gotten a leg up, for lack of a better way of describing it, you know, up to 75% or more of the cost of deploying that network. And so it seems that the rational, reasonable approach is to have that funded provider be the one who's responsible for maintaining service to those locations and serving adjacent areas, rather than the legacy provider who happened to be in that community as a, you know, as a traditional company who is offering services that are no longer being purchased by consumers, and who has had a funded competitor overbuild their network. So they're even in a less competitive position than they were previously.
Conceptually, I do appreciate that point, and I think there is a logic there, and I wonder, however, if the BEAD recipients will feel that that's the benefit of the bargain that they struck in accepting BEAD funds and building out these projects? Do you think that they would expect to then be the provider expected to serve new development that they were not funded to support?
I mean, I think it's a question for the commission to address. There are service obligations associated with BEAD for the funded addresses, and so, you know, I can't speak to whether the recipients of the funding would like to, you know, take on that responsibility, but it does seem like a more reasonable home for a carrier of last resort obligation, such as it exists or is adapted over time, than in a legacy provider who's just had their traditional service territory overbuilt, you know, with government funding. I should also maybe just would want to add, so we're talking about the OpEx, right? That, you know, BEAD is an OpEx, excuse me, a CapEx program, and building networks is very expensive, but it's actually only 30% of the cost of the network over time. 70% is OpEx, you know, maintaining, servicing customers over time. And so when you have a funded provider in a community, they've gotten that leg up, they've gotten they're offering a better service, so they're going to be winning more customers, and then they have that anchor for shouldering future expansion.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I will offer Cal Advocates the opportunity to respond very specifically to that point, and then I have a separate question for you as well.
Thank you, Commissioner. We have to think about networks as, especially if there's adjacent development, it's incremental cost, right? It's not like they're building something completely from scratch or just extending a network that's already been built. I would probably take issue with the 30% of the cost is the construction. I actually think the construction, the one-time sunk cost is the largest cost of building these networks. Fiber in particular has exceptionally low maintenance costs. It's why you hear, that's why there's so much interest in retiring copper networks, is the OpEx is wildly different between one and the next. In terms of the scenario you described, one suggestion we had in our proposal was the exiting Kohler as part of their mandate to build out broadband before exiting should also be obligated to build out to planned development. So within a reasonable time frame, if a local government already has a development in mind, if there's already construction in place, then as part of a limited window of time, that Kohler should still be building out to those areas when it's made available. I also think there is an awful lot that could be done on regulation of the rights of way, access to conduit, things of the that really drive down the cost of deployment that would make it awfully easy to continue to expand a network into these areas.
Thank you. And regarding Cal Advocates' proposal, I will characterize it, and please feel free to correct my characterization. I understood Cal Advocates' proposal to be something of using carrier of last resort withdrawal as the carrot for building more advanced networks. If you, as the existing carrier of last resort, build a more advanced network, you get out of the obligation to be the carrier of last resort. But as I read about the nature of the proposal, it also felt like there would be continuing asymmetric obligations for this former Kohler that are different than the obligations that every other communications provider that was never a Kohler has. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about, first, maybe a question is that a fair characterization? And second, why do you see that as justified?
So it is a fair characterization in isolation. I think the commission is undergoing a number of updates throughout the communications market in general, in terms of regulation of VoIP, regulation of service quality. We are in favor of equalizing the rules for all broadband providers. In the instance of Kohler exit, you can only regulate the exiting Kohler, as part of that. So that is why it may appear in isolation asymmetric, but we have regularly supported consistent obligations to protect public safety, ensure access to high quality services, affordability, and we will advocate towards that in terms of, I would say, unifying the regulations across the broadband market. I think what the industry has said, and it's true, is there is a mass migration towards IP-based services. That is where voice communication services are going. There is no reason why the protection of consumer access to voice is just outdated as a result of technology. If we operated of that nature, most of our laws would just be obsolete within a handful of 5 to 10 years on average with any technology advancement. That's not how it works, though. And to your other question on the carrot stick dynamic, it really comes down to the fact that the COLR is situated with existing customers. The COLR has benefited substantially from public subsidy as well as a number of government support that has allowed the construction of that network. The network itself is valuable in terms of just the metal alone. I mean, the irony about copper theft, I think, illustrates the extent of the metal itself when recycled and salvaged as part of a transition to a new network is valued in the billions. And so what we stand for is not so much a carrot and stick, it's more the public is owed their due for what they have put into building these networks over the decades. And the bargain shouldn't be, this is what's good for shareholders as the end point. It should be what's good for everyone along the chain. The consumers who have been loyal customers to these COLRs for many, many years, as well as the company itself as part of the work. We believe in a long-term solution, a long-term win-win scenario versus what I think the CEO of AT&T is looking for is, how do I cut back my costs to maximize my profits in the most expeditious way possible?
And I will turn now to Frontier, and I wonder, in hearing about Cal Advocate's proposal, and as you've seen it in the papers they've filed, are there thoughts that you'd like to share with us now, and maybe there's some dialogue that you'd enjoy engaging in, and we can kind of tease out areas of agreement or disagreement between different perspectives.
Well, I would argue that consumers have gotten the return on the investment in the copper network. That was built when there was a rate of return paradigm. That paradigm has not existed for a long time. And as I said, the expansion that is happening today to bring fiber and enhance broadband services across the state, that's essentially all privately funded. There is some of the state funding. There is, BEAD funding coming up, but there's been, $18.8 billion of private investment. So that's not, as you know, Frontier's territory is largely rural across the state. So we're building in rural areas where the return that we expect to get on our investment is not the same return that we would get if we were building these buildings in downtown LA. So I would say consumers got their return on the investment, and it's now time to look at what should the obligation be given what is happening today in the industry, how much competition there is. Again, 16.2 million serviceable addresses. That includes small business, it includes residential locations. But there are 48 million voice connections in the state. So consumers are choosing choosing mobile services for voice, and they're not choosing POTS service. So, I would also say that I think there is the idea that because we as an ILEC have a presence in a community, that it's easy to win customers, that we don't have to spend a lot of money to earn a customer. We just deploy a new network and everybody comes to us. I mean, that is not reality. I wish it were, but it's not reality. Because we are facing competition from cable providers, from other, from CLECs, from wireless providers, we have to work very, very hard to win customers. And we have to invest in order to win customers. So it's just not true that if we build it, they will come. I wish that's how it worked, but it does not work like that.
Advocates?
So I do want to appreciate, I think Frontier has demonstrated post-bankruptcy the dynamics of return on investment and the number of years you apply to it, and what does that do to your constraints of where you invest. It is correct to say that competition, was, I would say, challenging for Frontier, where they retained an extensive copper network. They lost a lot of customers very quickly, and that's what drove the bankruptcy. The solution to that was to deploy hundreds of thousands of new fiber lines throughout the state of California, but they required the cooperation of their investors to approach it with a 10-year return on investment formula. These are all formulas decided by the private sector ultimately of where and who is appropriately upgraded. And it is governed by what the rules are at the end of the day, right? They had to work through the commission for that process. I don't think it is correct to say that it's easy, but it is certainly easier for a carrier who already has paying customers in place to approach financiers to obtain the debt necessary to make that transition. This is a unique market, a unique industry amongst industries. We don't have a world in most other products where when you drive the car off the lot, it gets more valuable right off the lot and for decades on out. That is what is happening in the communications market, where fiber is going to be useful as a mechanism to deliver data services for all things, not just voice, but for all things that will be reliant on that, and all the different business sectors and individuals that will need it, and the asset will be useful for decades to come. So my main critique of the resistance or assertion of cost really boils down to the fact that there is an expectation to make a lot of money very quickly with this infrastructure, and that is the constraint. And that is what's causing a lot of these weird contradictions that you've noted, Commissioner, on why can't you just push fiber further out to these areas, or why can't you just simply make these switches over here? Well, it just doesn't fit the very neat and tightly packaged formula of we're only going to try and build to a certain number of people. And the willingness to, and an analogy that might be useful is why on earth would they keep very expensive copper networks for such a long period of time? It's the used car versus the new car. The used car is paid off, the monthly payments are paid off, and it's time for people to get the new car, but the company is just kind of eager to keep holding that used car, is willing to keep paying the mechanic for the repairs, and to them, they're under a very short framework of profits, paying those immediate costs and not having to, and continue to keep the paid off asset for as long as humanly possible. That's how they've made their conclusion about what the best way to make profits are. Is that necessarily the best outcome for consumers? I would suggest no.
So just on that point, because this was a question that you asked earlier on an earlier panel. So, why not just put more fiber out in your network? So the network is very complex and totally interconnected. And it is not the case that you can just decide to fiberize one part of your network and go and put fiber over there where there's copper because, you just want to. There actually has to be fiber-capable electronics and, capabilities throughout the network so that then when you're overbuilding, you're connecting to a fiber network. So it happens like this, or, constellation coming to a common point. And so, it's one of the reasons why copper theft is a really big problem. Because if someone goes out and steals a strand of copper, we can't just go and replace it with fiber if there's not a whole fiber network in and around that area to support the new fiber. So, to say, well, just go put copper or fiber there over that copper network, it's not feasible. I mean, we are fiberizing our network. We're doing it as fast as we can. I think we're making really good progress. We have more than 2 million fiber locations in the state. But it's a process. And through the BEAD and other funding, there's been an express recognition that if you want to get better service to really rural locations, there has to be federal and state subsidy to support that. Companies can't do it on their own. Even really big companies can't do it on their own.
I guess my suggestion would be sometimes the big companies make mistakes about how they do their investments. There is a reason why a lot of small providers are able to do fiber in awfully difficult areas. There's a reason why there isn't a single big company in the state of North Dakota, yet 100% of the people there have gigabit fiber at a density of 11 people per mile. Substantially more difficult to build than California in terms of the financial capacity to pay for the infrastructure, and yet they pulled it off. And it always comes down to the fact that there has to be a willingness to say, we're willing to take a long-term investment strategy to upgrade this network because there's eventually the demand is there. It's just like any other essential service out there. The Department of Agriculture enjoys pointing out that they gave a number of low interest loans on electrification, and not a single loan ever defaulted in America, right? The demand is there for this stuff. It's just whether there's a willingness to invest and whether our rules allow them to pull back, which is ultimately, I think, the issue and concern here, to cut their losses, to discontinue service to raise profits, or not.
One more question for me for Cal advocates, and I welcome responses, and then I'll turn it over to the other moderators. What's the difference? So as I understand your proposal, it specifically requires the carrier of last resort to deploy service at 100 down, 20 up. What's the difference between the carrier of last resort deploying that service versus there being another existing service provider that meets that standard in the same location?
Well, I think in the immediate sense, it would be the underlying obligations of the carriers in question. But as I mentioned earlier, we support rectifying those asymmetries to eventually equalize the market, given the I think the entire transition towards IP-based services through broadband. I think it's also important that we are offering it as an option, right? A carrier can decide simply just retain its Kohler status. If they don't wish to upgrade to broadband, they don't have to under our proposal. This is for specifically a carrier who's seeking to exit their Kohler status. And how do we ensure that the public receives their gain of their portion of the benefit? It should not be as simply as a matter of 100% of this goes to shareholders, despite the level of public investment and the importance of access. To go back to the broadband map, as I mentioned before, it is wholly inadequate, and there needs to be a means of ensuring access is available to there because of 911 access. Right? We are really talking about life and death scenarios where the fact that you have 1 million calls that travel over POTS lines in California a year means that we got to get this right. And if we are going to allow a carrier to exit its historical obligation of Kohler, requiring them to deploy broadband, it ensures that at least there is a service there that works and a means of modernizing the rules and updating basic service to reflect a new modern network and industry that we have.
So maybe I misunderstood your question, because as I understood what you said, if there's another provider there, then why should a carrier of last resort have to duplicate a connection? And I would say they absolutely should not. The carrier of last resort obligation is not intended to ensure competition at a single location, but rather to ensure connectivity where there is no competition. And so to say in that scenario, the carrier of last resort should also have to build out to that location, that's just not what the whole basis of the carrier of last resort obligation is founded on. It's the carrier of last resort because there's no one else who is servicing that location. It's not a competition.
If I may.
mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify when I'm saying that the asymmetry of regulation obligation there, just because they're a broadband provider doesn't mean they offer 911 access as a default. A number of broadband providers do, but a number of them don't. So that's probably the most obvious example of why would it be insufficient for a broadband alternative to exist as a means to allow a Kohler simply just to discontinue service. I would identify that as the most obvious and straightforward one. There's been mention of, for example, satellite coverage is 100%. It misses some pretty key things. You can't call 911 over Starlink. You certainly can't, most people can't even subscribe to it today because it's already at capacity. I think nationwide, Starlink can hold about 5 million customers. That's an awful small number when you slice and dice it across the state of California, right? There's a wait list and a capacity constraint. So there are, it is more than just the existence of a broadband alternative that is in question here, because we're talking about critical voice service that offers, an essential connection to people.
So getting to these markets, let's call them, I can't think of any other name, but stanky exit markets, the rural markets where a carrier is only offering voice service, they don't have broadband, and they want to get out. What are your thoughts regarding the idea of requiring the company that's exiting to surrender the poles and sell the network assets to another company?
I don't work for AT&T. I can't speak
let's,
to that.
I'm sorry, I don't know your CEO. It's
Nick Jeffrey.
Jeffrey Exit Markets, let's call it those.
Well, in order to sell your poles, you have to have a willing buyer. In order to sell your network, you have to have a willing buyer. I mean, somebody has to want to buy that. I can't tell you that that exists in any market. And when we're talking about this funding going to competitors who were overbuild us with better infrastructure, why would they want to buy our less good infrastructure? They have equal access to the poles today. They have equal access to the conduit today. They have equal access to rights-of-way and easements today. So this historical benefit of, pole ownership, I mean, I would argue it's not a benefit. It is a cost center for Frontier. We, we charge attachment rates, but they're not compensatory. The cost of owning poles, maintaining poles, replacing poles, I mean, it's a very, very expensive endeavor for companies. It's not a benefit.
And just to follow up on that, I guess when I say sell, and you have a good point, is who would want to buy, but I think it also comes down to what is the price. And in terms of, particularly from tribes, we've heard interest in purchasing assets from carriers of last resort. So that seemed like something that would be interesting to hear your thoughts on.
I have thoughts. What I will say is we have not yet engaged with a tribe that has been interested in purchasing our poles or our infrastructure at any price.
So I think what I heard from Frontier earlier was regarding the fiber build out is we're building out as fast as we can. I know you can't give a specific timeline, like you can't say in 18 months we'll be there, but is there a more general timeline to when that could be complete? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it?
I couldn't give you a timeline. I mean, I can tell you that we have a public goal of 10 million locations by 2026. We're solidly on the way. We've reported that we've passed more than 7.5 million locations so far. We continue to invest. We continue to expand. Despite our size, which, when you look at all telecommunications providers, wireless and cable included, we're relatively small. We're an $8 billion company versus, I think Charter's like 127 billion or something. We are deploying fiber. We're the second fastest fiber deployer in the nation, just behind AT&T. So we're going as fast as we can. We're really proud of our progress, but it's not, it's not a you're done endeavor. I mean, it's a long-term endeavor for sure.
Okay, and those are national numbers, right?
Correct.
Okay. What if, getting back to the topic real quickly, so what about the idea of maybe limiting the, what I'm going to call a broadband kohler for now? I mean, I know that's really not what we're talking about, but to some very specific tasks, like, say, 911 accessibility or something like that. Would that work? Or maybe get less industry objections?
I don't have a good answer for you. I don't know if that would work.
To answer your first question, Judge Gogola, I think what I have found on average when you construct a network from scratch is around 5 years, and that is traditionally the norm. Some can go a little faster, some may take longer, depending on supply chain challenges or labor shortages, things of that nature. I mean, the United States as a whole, right now is importing 25% of the world's fiber optics in construction. It is happening in lots of places right now. And the reason why the demand is so high is because the ISPs recognize the value of the asset. I think Frontier really should be commended to being a very aggressive despite its size, but it stems from the fact that the only pathway out of bankruptcy from holding too much copper was to transition as much of that to fiber so that it's useful, marketable, and valuable to businesses and customers. No one wants, if given the choice, a slow, dilapidated network connection. And in terms of AT&T, they're seeing an awful lot of value in competing with cable, with doing fiber bundling with their 5G wireless service and leveraging the fiber network. That's something that's not necessarily part of Kohler in terms of the discussion, but the other part that's driving a lot of the infrastructure and demand is all future wireless is dependent on fiber too, even satellite. And so this is why we are suggesting as part of the transition from Kohler that we do need to start thinking about broadband as part of the new voice communications infrastructure, because all things are transitioning to IP-based infrastructure, with fiber being at the center of it.
The dependency on fiber, though, for satellite services and mobile services, it's not at the end user location. I mean, it's backhaul fiber, right, to the tower, to the land station. That's happening today. I mean, that is happening on a business-to-business basis. It's a key area of investment, and I think a key area of economic growth. So, that's something that all companies are doing because it's important for the economic health of, both our companies and the communities that we're serving.
Well, it looks like we can wrap early. I really appreciate both of our panelists participating. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Remark. I want to first thank all of our panelists for participating. I want to thank all the CPUC staff who've made this possible, our IT staff, the communications division. Thank you, Judge Gogola. I want to acknowledge that there are some very divergent policy proposals among the different parties to this proceeding. Yet I think there are some shared values amongst the parties quite broadly. We're all looking to make sure that Californians are connected, that we're not leaving Californians behind. We want to see investment in advanced new networks. We want to see those networks get to more and more customers. So I'm looking forward to continued discussions, continued development of good data to help us make smart decisions in this case. We've got a ways to go, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you as we find a path to good outcomes that benefit the Californians that we're all looking to support. Thank you all again.
And just because many of you are parties to the service quality OIR, and maybe you haven't had access to your email, there is a PD that has been issued. You probably should look at it. You probably should also look at the comment period, because it's different from the normal comment period. It's the comment period was extended. So that's the real reason why I wanted to make sure you saw it, notice that, because it's different than the standard 20 and 5. So just making sure you saw that, and thank you so much for the great discussion today.